A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It started when I found an old Polaroid camera tucked away in the back of my late grandmother's closet. I remember the heavy smell of mothballs as I unspooled the dusty velvet cloth that concealed it, revealing a vintage model, weathered but still functional, the kind that had magic woven into its very being. My curiosity outweighed my hesitation, so I carefully inserted a fresh film pack, feeling a pulse of excitement as I turned it on, the camera sputtering to life with a familiar whir. I went outside, aiming it down the quiet, tree-lined street of my small town. We had moved here for the fresh air and slow pace after my parents divorced, but the shadows of that loss often clouded my mind. I snapped a photo of the old oak tree at the end of the street, and waited for the haunting white rectangle to appear, each second stretching into eternity. When it finally developed, I felt a chill grab hold of my spine. The image was different. The tree looked alive, almost as if the bark twisted into grim faces, their gnarled features captured forever in that small snapshot. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, I took another picture, this one of the concrete steps leading up to my porch. As I waited, I imagined the friends I left behind and their faint promises to keep in touch. Again, the photo revealed something I didn't expect, a distortion, a faint figure looming in the background, features too blurring to define, yet undeniably human. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped through the photos I had already taken that day, and there they were, the shadows lurking in the periphery, always watching me from a distance. With each passing day, the figure seemed to grow bolder, edging closer until one afternoon, the photo revealed a grinning face, eyes glimmering with a hunger I couldn't place. I tried to destroy the film, but the Polaroid had an iron grip on my attention. It felt like an addiction. I became obsessed, snapping photos of everything from my friends to the streets, the grocery store, even the school. Each developed image was more menacing than the last, the figure now merging into other backgrounds, creeping behind people like a detached phantom, mouth twisted into an unsettling grin that chilled my soul. I started to hear whispers around midnight when the house was still and the world succumbed to sleep, faint murmurs resonating through the walls, beckoning me, luring me like a moth to a flame. Sleep-deprived and tormented by my own mind, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, until one night, the bathroom mirror reflected a pair of eyes watching me, dark and hollow, lurking in the corners like it owned them. The haunting presence became a nightly fixture in my dreams, an entity that flickered at the edges of my consciousness, its laugh echoing through the darkness, but I still couldn't look away from the camera. My friends noticed the subtle changes in my behavior. My laughter was forced, my attempts to engage flat and muted. I showed them the photos, thinking they would validate my horror, but they grinned, dismissing my fear as an artistic touch, and I felt isolation swallow me whole as they laughed, unaware of the real terror hidden in those frames. The figure progressed from shadow to physicality, a form that began to materialize, its posture too unnatural to comprehend. One fateful evening, I decided to confront it, to take a picture of the unknown. Somehow coaxing it out into the light, the air crackled with tension as I snapped a photo of the corner of my bedroom, half shrouded in darkness. The blast of the flash illuminated a monstrous creature, a distortion of sanity, its mouth a gaping maw, eyes like black holes of despair, and I gasped, feeling a visceral pull of fear and regret. I staggered backward, heart racing, as the camera slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor. I stared at the photo, breathless, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination, but there it was, lunging at the camera, eternally caught in that moment, like a scream frozen in a state of terror. I couldn't escape the sensation that this creature was hungry, not for food but for something far more sinister, my very essence, my spirit. The next few days blended into an agonizing blur. I was too terrified to sleep, too restless to function. I came across a haunting legend online, an urban tale about the Polaroid man, a tragic figure said to materialize from the desperation of his subjects, absorbing their fears into his being, his twisted form growing stronger with every capture. I wanted to scream, to warn everyone around me, but the camera's voice became my only companion, urging me to take just one more picture, promising that it would all be worth it. I fought the urge until the night I found my best friend waiting outside my door, his familiar laughter slicing through the darkness like a lifeline, but the moment I grabbed the camera, instinctively snapping a photo of him, I watched as the Polaroid developed to reveal not just my friend, but the Polaroid man himself emerging from the shadows, lingering behind him, and in that instant, my friend's expression hardened, turning to fear as he stumbled back, not understanding that I had just signed his fate. That photo was the last straw. I felt like I was battling something unforgiving, and the weight of it crushed me. In a desperate moment, I decided to destroy the camera, bring an end to the madness. I tossed it into the fireplace, but before it could ignite, the entity climbed through my dreams, its laughter betraying me, taunting me. It wouldn't let me escape so easily. I watched in horror as tendrils of shadow curled around my wrists, spirits pleading for release, as their faces appeared in the flames, and in that moment, I understood the raw truth mirrored in those photographs. It wasn't just me. The Polaroid man had never been confined to one picture. He thrived on the fear and despair of everyone whose image he consumed. As panic welled within me, I felt entwined with the growing darkness, woven into the very fabric of his nightmare. I narrowly escaped, practically sprinting from the house, the devil on my heels. I ran down the street, the entity's whispers flooding my ears, the trees around me transforming into grotesque silhouettes. I had to warn my friends, but as I turned the corner, I saw them gathered, laughing, unaware of the phantom creeping ever closer. It struck me like a knife. Every snapshot had been a lure, a spell that would culminate in their demise. The Polaroid man didn't just want me, he had designs on all of them, feeding off their joy while I remained trapped in this waking torment. I could still hear him now, a tantalizing voice echoing through my thoughts, an invitation too perfect to resist as terror rippled through me, ripping screams from my throat as I grasped at the fabric of reality. But just before it consumed me, I made a choice. I knew I had to go back, to confront the curse I had unleashed. I turned, racing home, heart pounding like a war drum, knowing that I had to face the light or forever dwell in the shadows of the suffering I had unknowingly unleashed. The camera still lay waiting, its allure too powerful yet drenched in horror. As I stood there, the Polaroid man's laughter enveloped me, echoing through the empty halls, reminding me that the moment I took that first picture, I had invited something wicked into my world, something that smiled in the darkness every time I cursed my fate. And so, with a trembling finger, I raised the camera one final time, bracing myself for whatever unimaginable terror awaited me in the flash, knowing deep down there would be no escaping the price of my curiosity, or the sinister reality that now demanded flesh and blood. I never thought I would find myself in such a peculiar arrangement, but as the loneliness clung to me like an unwelcome second skin, I felt my options dwindling to nothing. I started hiring a sex worker just a few hours a night, not for the physical intimacy society typically associates with their profession but for something infinitely simpler, a warm body to hug and hold me during the crippling hours of the night while I drifted further into my own spiraling anxiety. This was the deal. I drew up a stack of flashcards laden with pre-written phrases, each one tailored to soothe the chaotic storm brewing in my mind, a comforting "you're safe here," a gentle "you deserve happiness there," sprinkled generously with the occasional "it's okay to feel lost." At first, it felt like playing a caricature of intimacy. Sarah, that was her name, was a slender girl with dark hair and bright eyes that flickered with curiosity over the flashcards I handed her. She held them delicately, like fragile treasures, never quite understanding the twist of desperation that brought me to her. Her soft voice echoed in the dim light of my apartment as the absurd words drifted into the stale air, wrapping around me like an invisible blanket, and, in a way, it worked. My heart would slow, my anxiety would fade, and in those moments, I felt alive, almost human. But as weeks rolled by, I began to notice the details, the way her laughter seemed to clip into the phrases at the wrong moments, or how sometimes she'd hesitate, her eyes clouding with a flicker of unspoken doubt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crafted a strange and twisted emotional prison for us both. She wasn't just a voice in the dark, she was a reflection of my deepest insecurities, a living, breathing testament to my fear of genuine connection beyond these artificial walls I'd erected. One night, as the autumn wind howled outside, a chilling unease settled over me, and it felt different, heavier, as if something sinister was lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane. I handed her the usual cards. "You're not alone. It's okay to be sad." But when she looked me squarely in the eyes, the emotion behind her gaze was unsettling, her smile crumbling just slightly as if the tiny, perfect pieces of my make-believe world were suddenly cracking apart beneath reality's relentless weight. I dismissed it, concealing a rising tide of fear within me, but a restless energy pulsed in the room like a warning siren. That's when she leaned closer, her breath sending a shiver down my spine as she whispered words I hadn't scripted or prepared for. "What if I don't want to say these things anymore? What if it's all fake?" Panic gripped me, and to mask it, I fumbled through my cards as if they could quell the storm brewing between us, but deep down, I understood, the life raft I had clung to so desperately was unraveling. Each time I asked her to hold me, the embrace felt increasingly foreign, no longer a bomb but a chain, and the thought struck me with morbid clarity: what if I was the one who was being trapped in this twisted game? My nights turned into restless, sleepless hours spent questioning the very fabric of our interactions. Was she merely a cipher for my empty life, a placeholder in a world filled with real connections that I refused to embrace? Days turned to weeks, and our routines morphed into a brittle semblance of something resembling friendship, a facade worn thin as the cards piled higher on the coffee table like a tombstone marking the death of my authentic self. The final breaking point came on a particularly stormy night, thunder rumbling ominously outside as Sarah breezed through the door, but this time she carried no flashcards. Instead, she stared blankly at the empty space atop the table before slowly delivering a disarmingly blunt confession: "I'm tired of pretending. I can't do this." Something inside me shattered at the sheer honesty of her words, as if the dam I had built against vulnerability burst, spewing forth a torrent of raw emotion. I begged her not to go, not to abandon me to the clutches of solitude from which I had sought refuge, and for one agonizing moment, our eyes locked, a broken connection crackling with a desperate energy, threatening to engulf us both in a frenzied whirlwind of need and fear. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, she handed me a card, one I hadn't seen before, words scrawled hastily in her jagged handwriting: "I see you." Tears stung my eyes as the truth of that statement crashed down upon me, revealing not only the anguish of my own existence but the realization that I had painted her into my own portrait of despair, reducing her to merely echoing the sentiments of a heart shattered by fear. In that moment, surrounded by the tempest outside and the quiet chaos within, I understood that every flashcard had only served to hide me from the silent screams for companionship that longed to break free. With trembling hands, I tore the cards in half, the silence that followed heavy with an uncertain mix of sorrow and relief. Sarah's eyes softened, and for the first time, our embrace felt authentic, alive, as we sat clenched in the uncertainty of what lingered between us, two souls, raw and exposed, both searching for warmth in this cold, chaotic world. But now, instead of me hiding behind her scripted words, we would find our own truths among the shambles, ready to brave the darkness together, knowing that embracing that truth was the only way either of us might ever rise again. I never thought I'd end up as the sole remaining employee of an abandoned water park, but here I am, trapped in a twisted love affair with a place that was once filled with laughter and sunshine, now overtaken by a creeping dampness and choking silence that feels alive in its own right. The energy splash was once the crown jewel of our small town, its twisting slides, lazy rivers, and sparkling pools teeming with families escaping the mundane heat of summer. Then, one fateful stormy night 3 years ago, everything changed. The water turned to sludge overnight, rides became rusted shells, and the joyful screams of children morphed into eerie echoes of despair, leaving only me behind, hired to help maintain what remained of the park. As I wander through the eerie remains of the once vibrant oasis, I find myself unexpectedly drawn to the glimmer of the fluorescent paint peeling off the walls, the faded mascots that stare with hollow eyes, and the chilling remnants of tubes and slides that form shadows at twilight. I remind myself it's just me and the ghosts of memories suspended in the stale air, yet, every creak of the plastic and whisper of the wind feels like they're taunting me, urging me to remember why I chose to stay. I first ignored the whispers, but eventually, they evolved into something more tangible. My nights became filled with the sounds of splashes and laughter that flickered in and out of existence, like a glitch in a hologram, the haunting reminiscence of what this park used to be. I'd sit in the fading break room where the walls seemed to absorb the fading echoes of children's joy and ice cream trucks. Sometimes, I could have sworn I felt the rush of water behind me or even glimpsed fleeting shadows darting in the corners of my vision, causing my heart to race and my skin to prickle with dread. I attributed it to my overactive imagination, tried to shake the thoughts around like wet hair clinging to wet skin, until last Thursday, when I decided to explore the depths of the staff-only areas where rumors of the old maintenance room had gone silent long ago. The second I stepped through the rusted door, an overwhelming splash of cold water hit me, freezing every bone in my body, and when I turned around to escape, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging me into darkness. It was then that I realized I was not alone. The smell of damp chlorine mixed with something less pleasant filled the air, and the shadows danced around me, coiling and pulling in a way that felt almost alive as they whispered unnervingly soft phrases that merged into a cacophony of insanity. I felt my heart race as the visions began, ghostly figures in swimsuits, their frozen smiles shifting as they reached for me, their outstretched hands dripping in thick, murky water. Some had screams frozen on their faces as if they were trapped forever, begging me to save them. At that moment, I understood that the park, this once celebrated land of joy, was holding the souls of those lost to its depths, and I was now part of that tragic narrative. I stumbled back, desperate to break free from the darkness, but the walls seemed to claw at me, urging me to stay in their suffocating embrace. The laughter turned into manic shrills, the waters surged in an unspeakable torrent, and as I finally squeezed through the door, it swung wide open, revealing the park twinkling eerily under the white moonlight, washed of all its previous colors. I dashed outside, stumbling onto the damp turf, gasping for air when a low, morose laughter echoed around me, the sound unfurling like the tendrils of a ghostly breath. I realized with horror that it was coming from the old lazy river, where every wave looked like it carried a piece of those oppressed memories, molded into the darkness that consumed me. How long before I joined them in torment? The park was alive and aware of my existence, taunting me like a cruel trickster, and as I sped towards the exit, the ground below began to tremble, and the guffaws of my phantom companions rose into a chaotic crescendo that threatened to drown me in despair. I plunged through the gates, feeling the weight of cold water on my ankles, swallowing shards of my sanity, and in that moment, as I looked back at the water park lit by the haunting glow of the moon, I swore to never return, only to find, the very next day, I was inexplicably drawn back, the whispering memories calling out to me, drawing me into an unwinnable game of hide-and-seek with the specters of my own imagination gone wrong. I realized now that I had become its reluctant guardian, forever chained to this place, its stories etched into my very being, transforming me from a mere employee to a keeper of its secrets, haunted not just by the park's cold embrace but by the thrill of its relentless pursuit. My heart racing, I finally accepted the park's invitation, knowing it would never let me leave, entrapping me in a beautifully horrifying cycle of fear and fascination, and as I stood at the entrance, the laughter and cries returned, beckoning me back to the life beyond the gates of reality. I know what happens when you die, but I wish I didn't. Every night I replay the moment I crossed that line in my mind, letting the guilt gnaw at me like a ravenous wolf, and it all started with a flippant conversation between my three best friends and me, fueled by too many drinks and a fascination with the unknown. It began as harmless bravado. Joe, the loudest and most obnoxious of our group, proclaimed he'd once seen a ghost and dared us to spend a night in the old Whitmore house, reputedly haunted in the site of an unsolved murder decades ago. As the sun sank behind the mountains, turning the sky a bruised purple, we stumbled up the creaky staircase of that decrepit building, each creak echoing like a heart beating in anticipation. We giggled nervously as we set up our flashlights and laid out sleeping bags in the dusty living room, but as night wrapped its suffocating arms around us, laughter faded into fraught whispers. The air turned thick with an unseen pressure that made the hairs on our arms stand on end, and that's when it started. The chill seeped in through the rotten floorboards, wrapping around my throat as I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. A dark shape flickered just beyond the reach of our lights, and I cursed myself for not believing the ghost stories more seriously. I felt trapped between disbelief and sheer terror, and in that fervid moment, something whispered in my ear, shattering my sense of reality, "This is where you die." Laughter erupted nervously, echoing around the dimly lit room, but somehow it felt hollow, as if our fear had come to life and was watching us, and then the air thickened with a pulse, my heart attempting to match its rhythm. Joe decided we would prove our courage by venturing into the basement, and as we descended the stairs, the wooden door creaked to a close behind us, sealing our fate. Cold, damp air met us like the embrace of a corpse, and my stomach twisted with dread, the oppressive silence overwhelming me. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the darkness, crawling under my skin. I glanced at my friends, freezing them in the moment before chaos ensued. Shadows danced along the stone walls, and I don't remember who screamed first, but soon we were all shouting, stumbling over each other in our desperate attempts to escape, only to discover the door had locked itself. Joe and Mia, panicking, banged on the heavy wood, their cries morphing into pure terror as the growling intensified until it became a deafening roar. In a sudden rush of strange instinct, I dashed toward the source of the sound, practically bumping into the cold stone while urging Mia and Joe to follow. My heart raced as adrenaline surged, pushing me to confront the darkness that had swallowed our light. I turned a corner, and there, in the dim light of our dying flashlights, I saw it, a figure half-formed and grotesque, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, dripping with shadows like an autumn night. The sight clawed at my sanity, my mind fraying at the edges as it turned its gaze upon us. I felt something shift within me, an unspeakable truth sinking in. This thing welcomed our fear, it thrived on the very essence of our existence, and in that moment, I knew what death looked like, a strip of darkness so deep, it devoured the soul. Panic shot through me, sending me racing toward the staircase as I whipped around to grab Mia and Joe, but they were nowhere to be seen. I think I screamed their names, but the sound drowned in the monstrous wailing wrapping around me. I clawed at the door, the cold metal refusing to budge as shadows pressed closer, converting the basement into a living grave. It was at that moment something shifted, and I was abruptly flung against the wall, staring into the eerie eyes of death's visage, an endless void staring back at me. In a moment of pure terror, I felt myself being pulled, mind and body, into that abyss, consciousness slipping like water through my fingers. I awoke, or thought I did, in a realm unlike anything I'd ever known, everything stripped away, leaving only a raw, aching emptiness. I realized I was floating, neither alive nor dead, observing the very fabric of existence unravel as if my spirit had become one with the universe, witnessing every soul slipping through that void into the ideal space for redemption or damnation. Faces flashed before me, Morrison's reckoning with the choices that led to his demise, Laura's pain in letting go of her children, and the surge of pure hatred coursing through several men who had taken lives that would never give them rest. I screamed for Joe, for Mia, yet there was only silence, the awareness of despair twirling around me like smoke, thick and undeniable, and that's when I withdrew from the approaching vortex. I didn't want to leave anyone behind, surely if I could return, I could save them. I focused, clinging to one raw memory, the warmth of a hug from Mia, and suddenly, I was back, gasping for air beside the basement door, still locked but there was no one beside me, confusion flooding my mind. I slammed against the wood in pure desperation, its texture becoming slick under my fingers as it felt as if the whole house was shuddering in anguish, and I called for them again, the name echoing against silence. In an act of sheer will, I seized the doorknob, and with every ounce of strength I didn't know I had, I wrenched it open, stumbling out into the night air, but the moon cast no light. I called again, my voice fracturing the stillness as whispers pursued me, "They're not here. They couldn't save you." Days turned into weeks after I escaped, wrapped in the guilt of abandoning them, the visions of their faces shimmering at the corners of my mind, but the questions never ended. What happened to them? Where did death take them? Then, one night, lying in bed, I suddenly sensed it come upon me, a creeping despair that felt eerily familiar, like a distant echo. I bolted upright, scanning my room as if the darkness might yield an answer, only to realize my reflection in the mirror looked wrong, dead eyes peering back at me. And that's when I understood. I know what happens when you die because the darkness follows you always, lurking just behind your heart, waiting for you to falter again, and I'm drowning in knowing that the house isn't truly empty, it still holds their souls, longing for me to return, hammering the screams of regret into my dreams, always reminding me that I'm still one step away from the abyss. My father's cabin in the woods burned down last summer, a smoldering skeleton left behind after an inferno that lit up the night sky like some twisted fireworks display, its fiery glow echoing through the trees for miles until dawn came to smother the embers. I had always thought of the cabin as a sanctuary, a place where my family gathered to escape the noise of city life, but as we stood on the edge of the ruins a few days later, an eerie stillness blanketing the air and the acrid smell of charred wood teasing my nostrils, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had awakened within those ashes, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. My father was there, his face hollow, as if the flames had consumed more than just the cabin. He turned to me and said, "We should take a look," his voice a mix of resignation and something else, something raw that sent a chill down my spine. We stepped carefully through the rubble, shards of blackened timber crunching underfoot, the sun filtering through the trees casting long shadows that danced ominously around us. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave the memories buried beneath the char and soot, but another part, the curious part that had once marveled at the stories hidden in the woods, urged me forward. That's when I saw it, a glimmer beneath a pile of ash, an object seemingly untouched by the flames. My heart raced as I dug at the debris, unearthing a jade pendant etched with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the light, A whisper of green amidst the gray. As I held it up, its surface cool against my skin, a rush of unease washed over me, like stepping into a cold pond in the middle of winter. My father stepped closer, his eyes widening with recognition, and for the first time since the fire, I saw a flicker of fear behind his usually steady demeanor. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice tight, and I could feel the weight of something heavy settling between us, the air thickening as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I shrugged, the pendant dangling from my fingers like an anchor to a chilling secret, but the look in his eyes told me I had crossed a threshold I wasn't meant to. That night, I couldn't shake the pendant's influence, I could feel it calling to me, a soft tug at the edges of my consciousness, drawing my thoughts to the stories woven into the very fabric of the cabin, the stories my father used to tell, of spirits, guardians of the forest, and ancient rituals meant to keep darkness at bay. He had always dismissed those tales as folklore, but now, it seemed the lines of reality were blurring, and I could sense it beckoning to be understood, demanding respect for the knowledge it held. As I lay in bed, the pendant hidden under my pillow, strange dreams began to spiral through my mind, twisting my memories into grotesque shapes, the cabin in flames, topped with a silhouette that watched from the smoke, a pair of glowing eyes connecting with mine through the veil of fire, a silent warning that echoed with each heartbeat. The dreams grew more intense, more vivid, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were a mere product of my imagination, a childish remnant of the stories, or a genuine plea from whatever force had been disturbed. Day turned into night, and I found myself entranced, the pendant and my father's past merging into an intoxicating pool of fear and fascination. I confided in him about the dreams, hoping for comfort, but his expression hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We shouldn't have disturbed it," he murmured, looking away as if the act alone was a betrayal of something sacred. Motivated by a sudden and almost impulsive curiosity, I decided to return to the site of the cabin, the burnt earth still warm beneath my feet as I stepped carefully over remnants of what had once been home. The sun hung low, shadows elongating like fingers, and there it was, the pendant had begun to vibrate gently against my skin, as if tapping into an unseen pulse that resonated within the ruins. I knelt down and, just next to the ashes of the fireplace, I discovered another object, buried deep, a small, charred book, its pages frayed and blackened, yet the symbols on the cover matched those of the pendant. I felt an electric buzz surge through me, compelling me to open it. An instant regret washed over me, a cautionary voice echoing from the shadows, but my fingers moved of their own accord, peeling back the fragile pages to reveal sketches and notes, scribblings that told of a pact made lifetimes ago, a way to harness the energy of the forest to protect it from encroaching darkness, a darkness that now seemed hungry. Nervously, I scanned the words, wondering how my father could have owned something like this and never mentioned it. Illustrations captured spirits and strange rituals, pictures of animals, deer surrounded by blurring lights and linked to trees, faces built from the contours of bark. As I read on, the illustrations began to twist, the lines warping until they morphed into images of pain and sacrifice. My heart pounded in my chest as I pieced together the truth. The pendant was no mere trinket, but a key. I stumbled back, realizing I held something powerful, something that belonged to another time, a relic of a deal made in desperation. Had my father summoned something when he thought he was merely defending our home? As the evening descended, the woods around me grew silent, a heavy anticipation settling in the air, and then I heard it, a whisper, soft and melodic, creeping from behind the trees, beckoning me deeper into the dark, a voice familiar yet alien, laced with urgency and sorrow. I looked back at the remnants of the cabin, suddenly fragile, twisting my heart as the urge to flee battled against an insatiable curiosity that held me anchored to the spot. The ground trembled slightly beneath my feet, and I glanced down, realizing the pendant had begun to glow with a vivid intensity, aligning with the whispers like an incantation in the night. The woods were waiting for something, some decision, and despite the dread tearing at my insides, I felt a pull surging through me, the unspeakable need to understand what we had awoken. My father arrived just as shadows began to congeal around me, frayed edges forming shapes of barely their figures with hauntingly familiar faces, the creatures from the stories, guardians that traversed the real and unreal. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted, rushing towards me, but it was too late. I could feel the earth responding, the pendant vibrating in rhythm with my heartbeat, drowning out his voice in a wave of resonance, the whispers crescendoing until they enveloped us in a shroud of ancient power that pulsed with each breath we took. I had a choice, to hand it back, to deny whatever connection we had forged, or to dive into the unknown, to embrace the pact that had lingered, waiting for an heir. The moment hung between us, the weight of generations clasped tightly in our hands. With one final breath, one final heartbeat, I pressed the pendant to my chest, feeling the warmth seep into my bones, the follow of unbroken promises settling in my soul, and then with a jolt, I knew I would not turn back. No one's allowed to look at my brother when he eats, and if you think that sounds bizarre, just wait until I tell you why. It all started when we were kids, probably around the time when I was old enough to notice that my brother Vincent was different. He was the kind of kid who could charm the pants off a teacher with a simple smile, yet at home, he had this unsettling way about him during mealtime. My mom had a strict rule: don't look at Vincent while he's eating. She never explained the reason, just her wide, fearful eyes and a tremor in her voice whenever she said it was enough to cut through any curiosity I had. One summer evening, I decided to defy the rule. I'll never forget the smell of roasting chicken and mashed potatoes wafting through the air, a mouth-watering aroma that drew me closer to the table. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding with anticipation, while our parents chatted absently, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling in the air. Vincent dug into his food, his face illuminated by the soft golden light of the chandelier above. I tried to steal a glance but quickly caught myself, feeling as though an invisible force was urging me to look away. But my hands clenched in my lap, and I was determined. I glanced at him. Just for a moment, there he was, nearly polished clean of thought, as if a fog had smeared over his features, and just as quickly he stopped chewing, the fork suspended midair. My heart dropped. The moment felt electric, as if the world had gone silent, and I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears while my brother's eyes glazed over like a doll's. "What are you looking at?" His voice came out in a low hiss, not at me, but through the darkness, as if addressing an unseen presence lurking just behind me. My stomach nodded, and before I could make sense of the transformation unfolding in front of me, he dropped the fork, and the clatter sent chills racing down my spine. Our mom's eyes widened, panic rushing onto her face. "Vincent, please." And just like that, my brother reverted back to normal, blinking rapidly as if the food on his plate had been laced with a drug that slipped through the cracks of reality. I remember the way my parents went silent, a charged moment hanging in the air, thick with unsaid things. For the next few months, I continued to witness the oddities unfold during dinner. Vincent became intensely focused on his food, eyes darting around as if he were tracking something. Mom wouldn't let me ask questions, not about Vincent, not even about her fears of losing him. I felt trapped in a house plagued by a secret I needed to unravel. But the rule stuck: no looking at Vincent while he ate, so I learned to avoid the task of catching glimpses of him at the table through the dining room door for fear of what might happen. I thought I could endure it until the day of the incident, which only confirmed my worst suspicions. One night while I was in school, I was caught off guard as my parents picked me up. I could tell something was off. They were frantic, exchanging hushed words, their faces pale as if they had seen a ghost. I stood in the living room, fiddling with the hem of my shirt, and that's when I noticed the empty plate on the table, Vincent's plate, staring back at me like a challenge. I couldn't resist. I stepped closer, still hearing the muffled conversation from the other room until an icy chill pricked my skin. I leaned in, eyes fixed on the plate, hoping that it might reveal some hidden truth about my brother's monstrous transformations. It was then I saw it. The food wasn't simply gone, it was as if it had been devoured by something else entirely, tearing through everything and leaving nothing. Suddenly, the dinner bell rang in my head as I heard someone behind me, not my parents, but Vincent. I ran toward him, adrenaline surging through my veins. I had to prove I wasn't afraid, that I could look him straight in the eye. "What did you do, Vincent?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips as if I was missing some elaborate joke. I ripped the door open to confront him, only to find darkness settling, swallowing everything at the dining table. I scanned the room for signs of him, but he had vanished. I caught a fleeting, pale glimpse of him slipping into the shadows, his eyes glowing like distant stars. Panic washed over me as a memory jolted back, reminding me of the voices our mother would whisper in the dark when she thought I was asleep, the stories of how Vincent wasn't just my brother but something part human, something else born from the appetite of nightmares. That night, I couldn't sleep, clutching the sheets, the only conviction urging me to survive in a reality where even dinner could be a doorway into another dimension. That very same week, I watched as Vincent grew weaker, his demeanor shifting. The glow in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a haunting hunger, a yearning that felt more insatiable. As I lay in bed, pretending to be immersed in sleep, I heard the faint scrape of a fork in the dead of night, a sound I will never forget. It drew me in like a moth to flame, filling my chest with dread, but I had to know. I crept down to the kitchen, heart pounding in my ears. As I rounded the corner, the light shone brighter, illuminating the table where Vincent sat, face half lit by the moonlight filtering through the window, stuffing his face with what seemed like scraps, pieces of something I dared not identify, and before long, the air filled with an unimaginable stench that gripped at my throat like a vice. He glanced up at me, cheeks stuffed, and with maniacal glee said, "You shouldn't have come here." And those very words froze in my veins as I reached for the nearest pan, the thread of my brother's primal instinct brewing beneath the surface, a creature that could mask itself in charming boyish features while feasting on unspeakable things. Our eyes locked, tearing away the childhood bond, revealing something monstrous behind them, a void where love had once lived, and I realized what he truly craved. I wasn't just his brother anymore, I was on the menu. In an instant, I turned and ran, his laughter echoing behind me like a macabre serenade until I stumbled into the daylight, gasping for a breath, looking over my shoulder to find the dining room door now ominously ajar and him nowhere to be seen. I never returned home. I became a drifter, holding fast to every tale of missing children and whispered warnings of creatures in the dark, eventually leading me to this moment. The fear burned deep in my core that one day I might have to face him again. And the reason no one was allowed to look at my brother while he ate was simply that it had become something far darker, a rule to shield whatever last shred of innocence remained, locking the door on a creature who feeds on not just food, but also flesh, hearts, and the very essence of those who dare to glimpse at what lies beneath. When I found out my husband cheated on me, it felt like the floor dropped away beneath my feet, and everything we'd built over the years crumbled into a pile of shattered dreams and memories sharp enough to cut. Telling him I knew was the hardest moment of my life, he looked me straight in the eyes, his pupils dilating like a secret was a curse he couldn't handle, and for a moment, I thought I could see something flicker behind that familiar facade, something dark, something alive. After that confrontation, he changed. The warm, affectionate man I'd loved suddenly seemed like a stranger inhabiting his own skin. At first, it was subtle, a missed dinner, a half-hearted excuse to stay late at work, but then he started doing things that were outright bizarre. He'd sit up in the middle of the night, staring into the darkness, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought it was guilt, but then a chill slithered down my spine. It was as if he was channeling someone else, a spirit that inhabited him only during those late hours, and in the morning, he'd act like nothing had transpired, the vacant smile barely masking the upheaval roiling within him. The way he looked at me shifted too, there was a mixture of pity and fear, like he was scared I'd see through him, and I found myself wondering if I was witnessing the aftermath of his betrayal bleed into something inexplicable. I started watching him more closely, dissecting every little oddity. Why did he insist on wearing that old jacket of his from college, the one that smelled like stale cigarettes and damp wool? And why did he take long walks at odd hours, returning with a strange, unshakable energy that left me feeling hollow, like the person I loved had been replaced by someone who didn't belong? Each day, the shadows of familiarity warped the reality around him, weaving a tapestry of paranoia in my mind like I was trapped in a dark fairy tale gone wrong. I began to see things that couldn't possibly be real, like the time I found him in our bedroom, staring at an old photo of us, tears streaming down his cheeks while he whispered a name I didn't recognize. It was like he was grieving a ghost I'd never met. I confronted him about it, my voice trembling with rage and confusion, but he shook his head, eyes darting around as if he expected someone to materialize behind me. Over time, I became convinced he was sleeping with someone else, an eerie echo of a ghost, taunting me from within him, as if the weight of his betrayal had beckoned something dark, some ancient force that now had a hold over him. I searched through his belongings to find proof, anything that would expose him, but it was in those searches that I stumbled upon an old, leather-bound journal hidden in the back of his closet, the pages frail and yellowed with time. As I flipped through the words, my heart raced. They were written in a shaky hand that detailed encounters and incantations, rituals meant to summon souls from the afterlife, filled with a longing that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry," the last entry read, "but not to me." No, it was a plea to something else, something ancient, something that had taken root in his heart, perhaps even before our marriage. I realized then that he wasn't just haunted by guilt, he had crossed a forbidden line, and I was living with whatever darkness had seeped in during his dalliance. The next evening, I stood at the bedroom door, watching him sift through the journal under the soft light, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand, the air growing thick and cold around me as he seemingly descended deeper into this ritualistic trance. "John," I called out, my voice barely a whisper, and he froze, the light catching in his eyes and making them flare with an unnerving shimmer. He turned to me, but it was like I was looking at a stranger behind his eyes, something ancient and hungry lurking just below the surface. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers racing down my spine. I stumbled backward as he advanced, as if I were an intruder in our own home. Now, desperation clawed at my insides. I had to get out, but even the thought of leaving him had become a labyrinthine terror, twisting my heart with dread. I spent the night wandering the house, hoping to sense the familiar warmth of our love, but it becoming increasingly barren. The walls felt alive, whispering secrets and threats, the very air, heavy with something I could no longer bear. Days turned into a week, and my husband became more unreachable, fragmented, both the husband and the specter of something else. I couldn't be sure he hadn't physically changed, but every glance felt like a veil being pulled back, revealing the monstrous reality I had stumbled into. That night, I gathered the courage to confront him one final time. I found him standing in the living room, swaying as if in a trance, the shadows swirling around him in a dance that made my breath hitch. He turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw the complete absence of recognition. "She told me I had to do this," he said, voice laced with an unsettling calm, eyes gleaming with a fervor I had never seen before. "I have to bring her back." It was at that moment I understood, the woman he had cheated on me with wasn't alive anymore, she was a spirit, something he had tried to reclaim through dark means. "You're not bringing anyone back," I screamed, panic ripping through me, but it felt as if he was already lost to me, spiraling deeper into his obsession. I had underestimated the power of what he had meddled with. There was a thin line between love and madness, and now, I feared I was about to cross it. With every beat of my heart, a decision coiled tight within me, and I finally bolted for the door, fleeing from the home we had built together. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard him call my name, a haunting echo that sent a shockwave of dread through me. "You can't escape her," he said, and the shadows congealed at his feet, swirling like smoke. "She will always be part of me." I crashed through the door and the chill of the night air enveloped me, but it wasn't enough. The darkness followed, an intangible force chasing me down the street as I looked back toward the house one last time, seeing his silhouette standing in the doorway, a ghost rising in a home that was no longer ours. I could feel the weight of it on my shoulders, an unseen shackle binding me to someone who was no longer my husband, trapped in a web of loss that made every night a new horror show. I don't know how long I can run, but even now, when the sun dips and the shadows stretch long, something whispers my name, pulling me back to the dark. I've already made my choice, but I fear it may not be the last, and in this quiet town where the line between the living and the dead has thinned, I can only wonder how many other souls have become lost to their darkness. As a teenager in the late 90s, I was captivated by phone lines in the murky depths of their potential. Phreaking became my refuge, a world where texts and codes danced in tandem with telecommunication. I spent countless hours typing away on my old laptop, each sound buzzing with the thrill of control as I learned the tips and tricks to bypass the limits of the system, hacking into PBX systems, eavesdropping on conversations echoing through the void, usually mindless chatter about mundane life, but sometimes I'd strike gold with a voicemail filled with intimate confessions or the fleeting clicks of clandestine deals. I can still recall the adrenaline rush of breaking someone's credit line just for the sake of hearing them panic when they realized someone was in their business, marred by a mixture of innocence and mischief. However, my little juvenile escapades took a darker turn one fateful night when, during a routine scan of frequencies, I stumbled upon something different. It started with static, a sound that pierced the air through my earphones like an unsettling whisper, a frequency so low it felt like the hum of a distant storm. Curiosity pricked at me like needles, and I leaned in closer, recording the audio feed as it pulsated with an undulating rhythm, a heartbeat. The raucous static shifted, warbled, and then receded, revealing a voice, but not any voice. It was garbled, distorted, like someone speaking from the far edge of a nightmare, something primal and ancient, a cacophony of commands laced with a sharp, chilling sense of urgency. I felt my breath hitch as a shiver crept down my spine, Help us, it screamed in 1,000 voices overlapping, echoing through the wires. I gripped my desk, mind racing as I tried to discern if I was witnessing some twisted prank or if I had unwittingly stumbled upon an underground modulating network that orchestrated illicit actions. I pressed further into the feed, listening to the layers peel away until a whispering chant enveloped me, "They are coming, they are coming." With each repetition, panic surged through my veins as a thumping noise began to accompany the chant, a rhythmic pounding like footsteps approaching. My heartbeat synced with those invisible feet. I was glued to my computer screen, but I knew I had to switch it off, that I was bartering with something I could not control. Just as I raced to glance at the clock, a loud clang echoed from my phone, causing the screen to flicker ominously, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a reflection, something slinking in the back of my mind, a shadow moving behind me. Heart racing, I turned, but was met only with the empty room behind my back, the pale daylight betraying the sinister whispers that still lingered in my ears. Days bled into nights as paranoia mounted, it was all-consuming. I noticed strange numbers appearing on my call logs, calls that never connected and messages that read, "Why did you listen?" I changed my numbers, cut ties with everyone, all while the voices taunted and twisted through my mind. I thought I was free until one sleepy afternoon when the phone rang. I stared at the unfamiliar number flashing, a creeping feeling clawed at my sanity, reminding me of the countless eerie voices. Against my better judgment, I picked it up, and the static enveloped me with a terrible clarity. "Join us," the chorus intoned, layered with fervor, a sound that anchored me to the chair with a vice grip. I slammed the phone down, my pulse racing, and I desperately secured every door, blocking the windows with hastily positioned furniture as dusk fell like a heavy curtain around my house. Dread coiled around me as I went through the feeds again, trying to find where it had begun, something tangible, a name, a location, anything that would provide a clue. Hours faded as the sun slipped behind the horizon, the last remnants of light fleeing in the face of a growing storm outside. That's when the wind shifted to carry that unmistakable low static through the window panes, urging and gnawing at my sanity. The eerie thumping returned, insistent and louder than ever, now accompanied by scratching sounds, like claws woven into the fabric of reality, scraping against the boundaries I had erected. Terrified, I rushed to my laptop. With trembling hands, I opened the frequency again, until, in the embrace of chaos, I finally found the coordinates whispered before the static, emotionally charged till my heart pounded in my chest. They carved out a distinct location, 20 miles beyond my town, deep in a forest long considered haunted, drenched in rumors about a cult that went silent decades before. I sensed a pull, a compulsion overcoming my better judgment, and as the phone vibrated again, I could feel its grasp tightening around me. I could not ignore it. Fueled by terror and a bizarre sense of curiosity, I loaded my car and drove into the night, the steady glow of headlights feeble against the consuming darkness. I arrived at the forest's edge, the trees whispering against my car's windows, only the sound of an echoing heartbeat filling the silence left behind. Exiting the vehicle, I faltered for a moment, before plunging into blackness. With each footfall felt heavier, laden with the weight of unseen eyes piercing the shadows around me. Somewhere far ahead, in the clearing I could almost hear faint chants merging with the melody of the static I had once admired. The air thickened as a heavy fog consumed my senses, each step agonizingly slow, dread clawing at my skin like icy fingers. And then I saw it, a dim flicker of light in a clearing surrounded by black ominous trees. I crept closer, heart hammering, only to bear witness to an assembly of hooded figures, each one swaying in rhythm before a large, makeshift altar that pulsed with that horrible heartbeat I had heard before, its morose echo emanating from the very earth itself. They turned in unison towards me as if I'd stepped through an invisible veil separating realities, their eyes locked onto mine, deep, hollow voids, echoing back that same collective sound I'd come to dread. "You were warned." The static roared around me and for a beat, I felt the chilling realization of horror constrict my thoughts. I was not just a spectator here, I could hear them calling, voices mixing with inexplicable desperation, an all-consuming darkness that wanted me to join. I stumbled back, stricken by the pulsating energy that throbbed with weighty dread. I turned to flee but found the path twisted before me, the trees bending, closing in, squeezing out my very breath with an insatiable hunger. I sprinted back to my car, barely finding it, and as I fumbled with the keys, despair clawed at my throat. I finally succeeded, speeding away as cries blended with the static that still hadn't muted, echoing in my ears like a final warning as I realized it wasn't just freaking, it never was, it was calling to something deeper, something that had noticed my intrusion into their world. I drove until daylight broke, the crash of dawn burning back the shadows, a reminder that I was now tethered to something inexplicable. But the echoes don't stop, they haunt me still. I delete numbers, change lines, but every so often static sings through the air at night. Powerful whispers call out through the wires, always asking, "Why did you leave?" As I glance at the cracked screen of my phone that won't stop lighting up, I still hear the rhythm of the heartbeat pulsing like a clock in my mind, an uncomfortable reminder that I'm not completely free, I'm just waiting for the moment they decide to call again. I should never have asked my wife for a threesome on Valentine's Day. It started innocently enough, a playful banter over dinner that sparked between us when she jokingly suggested I was getting boring in bed. But as the wine flowed and the candles flickered, the joke twisted into something far darker, a nightmare lurking beneath our laughter and fluttering hearts. At first, my wife, Clara, laughed along, a dazzling smile lighting up her face, but as I proposed the idea seriously, her eyes darkened in a way I had never seen before, the playful tease morphing into a quiet storm brewing behind her gaze. I felt a chill run down my spine, a warning I dismissed because I was too intoxicated by the thrill of the moment. Too enamored by the way her laughter struck me like music, too fixated on the idea of spicing up our lovemaking, and somehow, in the back of my mind, I neglected the knowing look that passed between us, one shaped like a question which I failed to answer. That night, as we fell into bed, the shadows casting ominous shapes on the wall seemed to swell with unsaid words, but sleep claimed me quickly, dreams swirling with fantasies I had conjured about fiery nights, the heat of another body aligned with ours. The next day, waking to Clara's silence suffocating the air, I felt an uneasy shift in our home as if I had awakened something buried deep beneath the surface of our relationship, something that twisted and turned, demanding to be released. We navigated through a fog as days passed, her smile strained yet resolute, and I wondered if I had taken a step too far on a road I thought was paved with pleasure, oblivious to the darkness that lurked in the corners of her mind. Valentine's Day melted into a haze of awkward conversations and fleeting glances as Clara began to shut me out, her laughter replaced by a mechanical chuckle, her warmth receding like sunlight behind thick clouds, and all I had to comfort me was the quickening pulse in my chest that hinted at impending doom. Then came the night of our anniversary, a date I thought would reforge the bond we'd clumsily laid bare, accompanied by roses blooming with untold secrets and a decadent dessert laced with my desperate hopes. But instead it spiraled into chaos as Clara revealed she had reached out to a woman who lived nearby, a neighbor whose beauty and allure I often admired from afar, someone I had actually considered my unwitting muse, and mingling sympathy and rage surged through every syllable Clara spoke as she described the words exchanged, how the woman had offered more than just her body. I tried to reclaim the moment, to articulate how the suggestion was only meant to be playful, a miscalculation fueled by my own insecurities. But my protests fell flat against the wall of Clara's determination. Anguish washed over me as realization dawned. Clara was asking the woman over tonight, not for a night of passion but for a chance to rekindle something she thought I'd extinguished. With my reckless whim, her betrayal a dagger carving itself into the trust I had steadily built. Panic twisted my stomach, my heart pounding with the realization that I was no longer the husband I had envisioned, and if I didn't stop this now, I would lose everything I held dear. All the moments that made us an undeniable duo. As the clock ticked closer to the hour, anxiety clung to me like a shroud, but there was a sick fascination thrumming beneath, a yearning to know what would transpire, my mind racing to the unthinkable, the possibility of losing Clara to another woman's touch and the visceral sensation of exhilaration mixed with terror. Just as our doorbell rang, I glimpsed Clara's reflection in the hallway mirror, her eyes glimmered with anticipation, but a shadow of something deeper lurked beneath. Something cold and sinister that echoed the very feelings I thought I could inject back into our marriage. I opened the door, and there stood our neighbor, a confident smirk framed by cascading hair, an intoxicating figure that seemed to dance with shadows under the porch light, and she stepped inside without hesitation, the air growing dense and electric. As Clara engaged her in conversation, I felt like a silent specter spectating a ritual that had spiraled out of control. The atmosphere thick with what I tried to dismiss as apprehension but was slowly unraveling into despair when I realized Clara was captivated by her in ways I had only dreamed about, the woman leaning in closer, whispering sweetly into Clara's ear, seducing her with promises I couldn't compete against. I watched as desire flickered in Clara's gaze, my own heart sinking with the crushing reality that I had given wings to this. The instance bore down heavier, the weight of consequence pressing against me until it simply shattered my grip on reason. Eventually, they retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room, where the air crackled with charged electricity mingling with sweet, sickening betrayal. I paced, consumed with dread and anger, desperately clinging to the remnants of our life as I knew it, wanting to scream, to burst the ever-thickening bubble of uncertainty. Then the sounds began, moans that echoed through the otherwise silent house, an impossible crescendo that turned primal, every wail stabbing me deeper, each cry making it clear that I had set this catastrophe into motion. In my desperation, I grabbed my phone to call Clara, to beg her to stop this madness, to confess that my bones ached from tormenting doubt, but before I could dial her number, the lights flickered, a sudden, unexpected outage that plunged me into darkness. Panic clawed at my throat as silence enveloped the house, and I stumbled through the shadows, struggling to find my bearings when I finally crossed the threshold of our bedroom, the door ajar, revealing an impossible sight, Clara, but her eyes glinted gold as shadows shifted behind her, coiling and twisting with an otherworldly presence. The neighbor stood beside her, her visage contorted in delight, and as I gasped, wanting to cry out but unable to utter a sound, I comprehended the unfathomable horror. I hadn't just invited another woman, I had opened the door to a realm that joined desire with the charms of darkness, allowing insidious forces to drag Clara away from me, rooting her to the scorned desire she now embraced. And in that moment, I understood that I should never have asked my wife for a threesome on Valentine's Day. I've always known my husband, Mark, to be an eccentric artist, a genius trapped in the mundane, with canvases splattered and chaotic like his thoughts, but lately, there's been something chilling about his work. It started a month ago when he brought home a new set of oil paints in shades that seemed far too vivid, almost alive, hues that gleamed under the fluorescent kitchen lights, and urged him to show me what he was working on, but he just waved his hands dismissively, saying he was in the zone, so I left him alone as he locked himself away in his studio for hours on end. During those stretches of silence, I'd often hear soft whispers seeping from under the door, like the taunting echoes of some ghastly conversation that kept my internal alarm bell ringing. I tried to brush it off as mere imagination until one night, curiosity gnawed at me, and I took a peek. I swear I saw him standing there, brush in hand, his eyes wide and frenzied, staring at the painting he was creating, a portrait of a woman whose face was disturbingly vivid, right down to the soul-deep sadness reflected in her eyes. They seemed to glisten with regret, and something about the painting made my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the feeling it was more than just oil or canvas. In fact, it felt like it was alive. It's as if the very brushstrokes pulsated with some entity, and why couldn't I shake the feeling that the woman in the painting was watching me too? I stumbled back, my throat dry, fought off a wave of nausea, and headed back to bed, praying sleep would ease these disturbing thoughts, but rest didn't come, not while Mark continued to paint in the darkness, creating a symphony of gasps and strange movements echoing in the night. I could hardly focus on anything for days. Even when Mark emerged from his self-imposed darkness, he seemed different, paler, withdrawn, speaking in broken sentences as if he had trouble forming thoughts, and the paintings continued to multiply in the studio, each one more haunting than the last, showcasing fragmented scenes of despair and shadows in corners. I started asking him about them, trying to understand if it was just an artistic phase. He only stared blankly, his once inquisitive nature replaced with this eerie calmness, claiming it was just a way to express himself. But I couldn't escape the feeling that these pieces were more like glimpses into a nightmare. With each passing day, I saw changes in him, moments of laughter replaced with aggression. He would throw things across the room if a throw pillow fell out of place, and it horrified me that something so simple could set him off. The realization hit me like ice water. I was losing him to whatever madness was lurking in those canvases. After a particularly volatile episode where he screamed at me for stepping into the studio without permission, I decided to confront him, but found myself unexpectedly paralyzed, standing frozen at the doorway as he furiously painted a scene that roared with pain, depicting a figure shackled and screaming, and in an instinctive dart of panic, I flipped on the lights, plunging the room into harsh illumination only to reveal that there were no paintbrushes, just streaks of fresh blood running down the side of the canvas, transforming its agonizing images into something grotesque and terrifying. Mark turned to me, and his eyes. They weren't my husband's anymore. They burned with a merciless hunger, reflecting the raw essence of a man possessed. I fled, my pulse hammering in my ears, and I spent nights listing scents in the air that were choking me. Concerned friends asked after him. When I answered, I felt like a traitor because every word reduced him to a monster. Then it all took a turn for the eerie when I began receiving odd notes slipped under our door. They were messages sketched in charcoal and full of unsettling poetry about desire, despair, and loss, always signed with one ominous initial, A. I realized they were responses to what Mark was creating. Each note chillingly reflected his latest painting, like someone was watching us from an invisible mirror. My paranoia at its peak, I decided I had to put an end to it. I locked myself in the studio one night, determined to confront the source of his madness, but as I moved closer to the paintings, the whispers enveloped me more intensely, transforming into a cacophony of cries and laughter. I could hardly breathe, but I found myself drawn to the latest piece, which almost looked like a portal. The colors swirled hypnotically as I touched it. An icy jolt slipped through my veins, images rushing at me, visions of torment and despair, and screams for help reverberated around me until I was nothing but a doll trapped in a whirlwind of pain. It was like I was trapped inside his mind, feeling his hunger for fame and the consuming need to create. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed whole, and as reality shattered around me, I realized I was becoming just another subject. I jolted upright in bed, gasping, only to find the house cold, heart racing, and Mark was sitting in the corner, staring at me blankly, his own visage haunting to behold. I rushed for my phone to call for help, but as the light flickered on, I noticed my own face staring back at me from the walls of our bedroom. My own expression of anguish stretched across the canvases he created. My pleas were now woven into his artwork, trapping my essence, forever in torment as I realized with horror that I had become the subject of his masterpiece. The next gallery showing awaited us and he would unveil me among his greatest works. Pulling the curtain back, and there in the spotlight, he smiled, but it wasn't Mark anymore. The real Mark was lost somewhere within the depth of those haunting strokes, and as the darkness swelled within him, only the connection to that woman in his paintings remained as the final brush stroke was laid down, sealing my fate and trapping me in a nightmarish gallery, forever watching as he shared his twisted realities with the world. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, bright enough to make you squint, with my usual route home winding through the neglected alleys behind my apartment, a shortcut I had taken countless times before, feeling like I owned those shadows. But this time, something felt off. It was different, an uncanny sensation creeping down my spine, urging me to turn back, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself it was just the lingering effects of an unsettling horror film I'd watched the night before, and I continued on, my footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement, when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker, a shiver of movement, but when I spun around, there was nothing but an empty alley, the shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped lower, and then it happened again. The pit in my stomach wrenched tighter as I noticed that my shadow, sprawling behind me, was behaving strangely. Where my feet should be, it seemed to distort, elongating and curling like it had a will of its own, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw another shadow next to mine, mimicking my movements perfectly but somehow lacking that distinct tether to my body, and panic surged like ice through my veins as I accelerated my pace, heart pounding against my ribs. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to me like a thick fog, and as I turned another corner, the alley opened into a derelict courtyard, littered with forgotten things and smells. Where I paused to catch my breath, the light was fading quickly, the shadows growing bolder, and that's when I saw it, a dark shape floating just beyond the perimeter of my vision, darting in and out of the nearby crumbling walls, weaving a sinister pattern that sent jolts of terror through my mind. But before I could process what I was seeing, I heard a soft whisper, a voice that beckoned from the shadows, chilling my very soul, urging me to come closer, and in response, my shadow twisted and curled, drawing nearer to the voice, as if it had its own dark consciousness. While I stood frozen, helpless to resist the pull, I felt myself step forward, almost involuntarily, when suddenly a figure stepped into view, a gaunt woman, her skin pale and her eyes hollow, staring at me with an intensity that paralyzed me, her presence shimmering with an otherworldly aura, and she pointed to my feet, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to scrape against my ear like nails on chalkboard, "Always check for your shadow." My thoughts raced as I glanced down, horrified to see that my shadow was now almost completely free, dancing in the last dying rays of sunlight like a puppeteer pulling strings, ready to break away completely. And with a primal scream, I turned to run, my feet pounding against the ground, adrenaline flooding my system, desperate to escape whatever horror lay behind me. but the alley seemed endless, stretching farther than I remembered, with my shadow prowling behind, relentless as it enjoyed this game of chase, as it flicked in and out of the corners of my vision, gaining ground with every desperate step I took, until eventually, in my terrified rush, I stumbled, falling to the ground as the cool pavement greeted my cheek, and as I pushed myself back on my hands and knees, I dared to look over my shoulder. The woman was gone, but my shadow loomed large over me, black and ominous, as if anticipating my next move, and I could feel it tugging at me, whispering secrets of darkness that promised freedom. "Let me take the lead," it seemed to hiss, and with one last ounce of fear, I bolted upright, racing towards the nearest street light, the aura of safety emanating from its warm glow. But just before I reached it, the shadows receded slightly, and I felt an iron grip ensnare my ankles, holding me in place, the evil presence laughing in some diabolical way that reverberated through the alley, while I fought against it, twisting and thrashing, but it only tightened, dragging me back, and I screamed for help, my voice echoing against the unforgiving walls, but the silence that responded was deafening. Just when I thought I would be consumed whole, somehow I broke free, the shadow faltering for barely a moment, enough for me to lurch toward the safety of the flickering light, where the darkness couldn't touch me, and as I gasped for breath, looking at my feet beneath me, I realized with horror that the shadow I fought was no longer just a reflection but a sentient being, a creature that had tethered itself to me, gnawing at the edges of my existence, feasting on my fear. I never dared to look back as I fled toward home, my heart pounding, but as night fell and I settled under the thin veil of sheets, I caught my breath and closed my eyes, thinking it was finally over, until the unmistakable chill of presence filled my room, and dread overwhelmed me, forcing my eyes open. Beneath the slant of moonlight, I saw it there, a shadow in the corner, its form shifting, reaching out towards me, humming the same sinister song that haunted my night. Whatever I had run from had followed me, whispering into my ear the words I feared most: "Always check for your shadow." The last thing I heard before the darkness enveloped me entirely. I've spent the better part of a decade working as a local journalist, covering everything from petty crimes to local festivals, and it has given me a keen sense for stories that claw at the back of your mind like the tip of a fingernail. But nothing could prepare me for the inexplicable case of John Doe, a name that has haunted my waking nightmares since the dawn of this unspeakable episode. It all began when I received a call from my editor about a body discovered just off the old county road, the one that's almost entirely forgotten but notorious in whispered conversations about things that should remain hidden. When I arrived at the scene, the air thick with a stench too potent to be labeled simply death, I was struck by how ordinary everything initially appeared: a white male, middle-aged, presumably homeless, lying in the dirt like discarded refuse, with nondescript clothes covering an unremarkable physique. It was the face, though, that made my stomach churn, not out of horror or disgust but from an inexplicable sense of wrongness. His features were warped, somehow familiar, yet wholly alien, like a fractured reflection in a funhouse mirror, eyes blank, as if the unseeing void peered back at me with an insatiable hunger. As I knelt down to examine the body, an unmarked piece of paper caught my eye, crumpled and yellowed, tucked beneath his arm like a secret letter never meant to be found. With hesitant fingers, I unfolded it to reveal a tightly scrawled message that read, "I didn't want to be here," which sent a jolt of confusion straight through me. I don't know why, but I took the paper and hurried back to the office, hoping to unlock some hidden truth that lay tangled within this mystery. Days turned into sleepless nights as I pored over the contents of old police reports and obituaries, searching for anything or anyone that could connect to this man, John Doe, but I found nothing. Each lead turned into a dead end, like the deepening spiral of a nightmare, until finally I took to the streets, canvassing the local shelters and parks, asking the homeless about the man with the distorted features, but each inquiry was met with nervous glances and whispers of phantom shadows. It was there, in the dim lighting of the rundown shelter, that I encountered Rose, a frail woman with silver hair and eyes that glistened with the weight of unshed tears. She took one look at the paper I showed her and gasped, her hands trembling as she recited a story I could scarcely believe. He was once a good man, a caregiver to lost souls. Locals loved him, but there was always something wrong with him, a darkness that seeped from his pores, especially on stormy nights when the void invited demons. When Rose spoke, the electricity of her grief danced around the room, and I could feel the atmosphere shifting as if the very walls of that cramped shelter wanted to consume her sorrow. Fueled by a frenzied mix of compassion and dread, I begged her to share more, too. Tell me about this John Doe and the darkness that swallowed him whole. but just as she was about to unveil some ancient truth, a screeching siren echoed through the air, and the shelter abruptly locked down, plunging us into an eerie silence, the world beyond muffled under the weight of dread. With nowhere else to turn, I snapped a photo of the crumpled note in my pocket and pressed forward into my research, unwittingly revealing a web of disappearances stretching back years, some dating as far as I could remember, each victim eerily resembling John Doe. My nights turned sleepless as I scoured forums in the deepest recesses of the internet, unraveling a tale that grew increasingly sinister. I stumbled upon whispers of an ancient cult, the Rook Society, known for whose members drew power from the suffering of those lost to the void. The deeper I dug, the more I noticed shadows that seemed to slither just out of view, always flickering at the corners of my vision. Just when I thought I'd made a breakthrough, I found a photo of a gathering. There in the background, loomed the face of John Doe unmistakably smiling, with a sickening familiarity. The realization hit me like a freight train, every hair on my body standing at attention as I recognized him not as a stranger but as an old neighbor from my childhood, someone I thought was long gone. A man who had once handed me candy and told me tales of worlds beyond our own. I felt a cold rage igniting inside me as I realized they had taken him, the Rook Society, drawn by his kind heart and twisted it into something grotesque. With nothing left to lose, I set out to confront this society head-on, following the thin threads of shadow that led me to an abandoned church at the edge of the woods, the very same ones where we used to play as children. When I entered, the air fitted like a shroud around my body, and the congregation stood in a circle, chanting in low voices, the words twisting like poisonous vines, and just beyond their ritual, I caught a glimpse of John Doe, now tethered to a wooden altar, his features worse than when I'd first found him, twisted and chained as if he had become a marionette dancing on strings of despair. Desperate to save him, I screamed but my voice was swallowed by the darkness, and the congregation turned towards me, their eyes ablaze with hunger and malice. They were not human anymore, they were nightmares woven from shadow and madness, and their chants rose to an agonizing crescendo. In that moment, the realization slammed into me like a tidal wave. John Doe wasn't just a victim, he had become a vessel for their darkness, a reminder of the souls they had consumed, and there was nothing I could do. I stumbled back as everything I thought I knew began to unravel, the bitter truth dawning on me, pulsing like a heartbeat in my ears. The John Doe that I once knew had been changed irreparably, swallowed by the very void that gave life to the Rook Society. My breath came in. Panic gasps as the lights flickered and the shadows surged forth, enveloping my vision in a sinister embrace. The last clear thought I had was that I would become yet another name lost to the void, swallowed whole in the sinister hands of whatever force haunted these woods, because in the darkness, as the chanting reached its fever pitch, I finally understood, we are all just fleeting shadows, whispering names that will fade into the night, like John Doe and the nameless faces swallowed by the abyss, echoing forever as a reminder that sometimes the stories we chase are much darker than we can ever imagine. In deep Appalachia, Halloween night comes with rules, and the locals abide by them with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred rites, rules passed down from generation to generation that my in-laws had never bothered to share with me. Just last year, my wife and I decided to spend our first Halloween in her childhood home, a weathered cabin hidden in a thick forest, and I couldn't help but feel the eyes of 100 generations watching me from the shadows as night fell. The evening started innocently enough. We carved pumpkins on the porch while the sun dipped below the horizon, illuminating the crooked bones of the trees. My wife, Ivy, wore an anxious smile as she reminisced about the Halloween parties her family used to throw. They would dress up, host bonfires, and tell ghost stories, but as she spoke, a flicker of hesitation danced in her eyes as she veered into the subject of the rules, which she'd always avoided. Earlier, as a storm rolled in, she urged me to stay close to the house, whispering that once darkness settled, the woods would change. The first rule, she said, is to never go into the woods after dark. I shrugged it off, hardly believing in some rustic superstition, but the way her fingers trembled over the pumpkin knife made me think twice. As night enveloped us, the cabin creaked ominously, and the wind howled like a wounded beast. A sharp knock echoed at the door, and Ivy froze. It was odd for trick-or-treaters to brave such a remote area. When she opened the door, standing there were two children in tattered costumes, just shadows of what they could have been. They didn't say a word, simply stared with wide, glistening eyes that held a depth I couldn't quite understand. Ivy whispered for me to give them candy, just let them go, but something in the air shifted as I handed them treats, their laughter cutting through the night like glass. Before they left, One of them, a boy with dirt-streaked cheeks, leaned in close and whispered something in my ear so quiet I almost didn't catch it. Stay out of the woods on Halloween. The old one's awake, and they're hungry. The chill rippling down my spine was enough to stir the primal instinct of fear. That night, as I nestled under the covers, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a couple of kids playing a prank, but Ivy wouldn't sleep. The wind howled louder, and I listened to her whispering old prayers, words that slithered around the cabin like smoke. She finally confided that her family had always believed in the old ones, a lingering presence that inhabited the woods and demanded respect, particularly on Halloween. I brushed her off, my city intellect scoffed at such notions, but as I lay there, my curiosity, laced with fear, got the better of me. I peered through the window, the moon illuminating a trembling world of gnarled branches and swaying shadows. An irrational thrill surged through me, a childlike wonder battling against the instinct to flee. I told Ivy I would go for a short walk, just to ease my restless nerves. She begged me not to, her eyes wide with a mix of anxiety and anger, but something twisted inside me, a stubborn need to prove there was nothing to fear. Grabbing my jacket, I slipped out the door, the cool air wrapping around me like a chill embrace. The woods loomed, vibrating with the unsung stories of the night, whispers curling with every step I took deeper into the trees. The haunting moonlight painted the trail silver, guiding me while the wind rustled the fallen leaves, almost echoing Ivy's warnings, stay away, stay away. But the allure of the unknown was intoxicating, and I could hear the distant laughter of children. Was it imagined, or something primal calling me deeper? As I wandered, the shadows thickened, and a palpable sense of dread filled the air like fog, pressing down on my chest, warning me that I should turn back. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear when suddenly, I stumbled upon an ancient tree at the heart of the forest, one that seemed to hum with life, every root woven with tales of the past. Its bark was cracked and twisted like an old crone's face, gnarled hands reaching out to ensnare the unwary. And then I saw them, shadows flitting around the tree, those same two children, but they were no longer just spectral figures in costumes, they were real, their faces obscured in the darkness, but their laughter echoing sharper now, mingled with something more sinister than delight. Join us, they sang as they danced, their voices sweet and beguiling, luring me closer against my better judgment. Panic set in, the laughter was too high, too shrill, and I started to back away when the atmosphere snapped like a taut string, and the world felt wrong, as if the fabric of reality had unraveled. The slightest rustle broke the tension and drew my gaze upward, and suddenly the children were gone, replaced by figures hunched and gruesome, each face twisted into a mask of pure hunger. Dread clawed at my throat as I turned and ran, branches snagging at my clothes, the wind howling with a cacophony of mourning and laughter, all blending into a frenzied symphony that echoed the chaos in my mind. The path back to the cabin seemed non-existent, shadows folded into an endless maze, and I heard them behind me, chanting my name in a sing-song fashion. Panic drove my heart to race, and it became painfully clear that the old ones were awake and they were not playing. I ran blindly, branches tearing at my skin, and just when I thought I would be swallowed by the night, I caught a slice of light through the trees, a beacon of safety. The cabin door stood ajar, an open mouth beckoning me inside, and I dove through, slamming it shut behind me, gasping for breath as Ivy was sitting upright, a mixture of panic and relief washing over her face. But before I could explain, her relief turned to fear as she heard it too, the faint echo of laughter outside, growing louder, more chaotic, and I understood with a sickening twist in my gut that we had invited something in with me. That was the real rule, a rule that I had laughed off. When you're in deep Appalachia, on Halloween night, never acknowledge the old ones, for they never forget, they'll haunt you long after the last flicker of the Halloween candle burns out. We huddled together, listening as the voices outside twisted through the wind like a razor. They were coming for me, coming for us, their insatiable hunger making the walls tremble. I swore that this had to be a nightmare, my city logic screaming for answers, but deep down, I felt the pull of the Appalachian woods, the call of the old ones reaching out to reclaim what was theirs. As I whispered a frantic apology to Ivy, the darkness shifted, and the laughter crescendoed into a terrifying chorus, and I knew they would take their due. My father walked out on me 20 years ago. Tonight, I found out why. The phone rang at an ungodly hour, piercing the stillness of my cramped studio apartment, and for a moment, I was too disoriented to answer. Memories of my childhood swirled in my mind like autumn leaves caught in a storm, My father's laughter, his warm embrace, the way the world felt safe when he was around. But that safety vanished when he left, dragging the fabric of my family apart, leaving my mother a hollow shell and me spiraling into silence, the questions of why and where clawing at my insides. My mother always told me he was a coward, running away from the responsibilities of fatherhood, drowning in his demons, but I felt a different kind of emptiness, a yearning for closure, for answers. So when I finally answered the phone, half expecting the voice to belong to a telemarketer, the shaky breaths on the other end knocked the air out of my lungs. "You need to get out of the city. They're close." The voice was frantic, almost weeping, and it sent tendrils of dread creeping up my spine. Disbelief gripped me, but curiosity was stronger. I needed to know who had called, and I needed to know what they meant by they. With a jolt, I grabbed my coat and stumbled out into the night, the city lights casting an eerie glow on everything I passed as I questioned the whereabouts of my father and the secrets he must have buried. The streets felt warped and twisted, shadows licking at corners like they were alive, and I drove in a daze, following instinct to an old diner I had not recalled seeing in years, but was somehow drawn to, a place where he had taken me after I kicked the winning goal in the school soccer championship, a memory encased in sepia tones. Pushing open the door, an omnipresent bell jingled ominously, and the familiar scent of burnt coffee and grease felt like a ghost in the air, stirring fragments of my childhood. I half expected him to be at a booth, grinning that goofy smile that used to chase my nightmares away, but instead I was met by an older woman with tired eyes who recognized me instantly, a flash of recognition tinged with pity. "He's in the back," she said, nodding towards the darkness, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to flee, but I steeled my resolve and ventured deeper into the shadows. When I found him, a frail figure hunched over a table, I hesitated. The years had turned him from a robust man into a hollow specter, the lines on his face like scars from battles lost, the sadness in his eyes almost unbearable. "Why, Dad?" My voice cracked, raw with emotion as I struggled to keep the anger at bay, but his trembling hands held up a newspaper clipping, yellowed and frayed at the edges. "I didn't leave you. I was protecting you." The words hung heavy between us and I took a step back, the room feeling too small, the air pressing down as he explained how our family had been marked, cursed even, by something lurking in the shadows, a malignancy that fed on fear and sorrow. He spoke of the night he walked away, of the choice between keeping us safe or living in constant terror. I wanted to scoff at the foolishness of believing in curses, but the disbelief evaporated when he told me, there were certain things you couldn't outrun. And as if the universe was conspiring to prove him right, the diner's lights flickered and dimmed before plunging us into oppressive darkness. Panic erupted within me as the jangling of chains and guttural whispers echoed through the void. "They're here." My father's shriek pierced through the shadows, and before I could question him further, a figure emerged, draped in a tattered cloak, its face shrouded in darkness. It was impossible to discern features, but the stench of rot curled around the air, choking me as I stumbled backwards. My father pulled me close, his grip like iron, whispering urgently that the nightmares he thought were left behind were still hunting us down, souls marked by fear, and now, it had come for me, too. The figure glided towards us with an unsettling grace, and with every step, I could feel layers of dread suffocating me, my heart pounding like a war drum. My father shouted in desperation, trying to shield me, but the creature raised a skeletal hand and unleashed a cacophony of screams that reverberated within the diner walls. I felt unglued, my reality unraveling as the shadows coiled around us, plunging me into memories I wished to forget, my father's absence, the night spent crying into the void, wondering if he cared at all. "Run," he bellowed suddenly, but as I combed the shadows for an escape, the figure lunged towards him. I screamed, paralyzing fear coursing through me, but my body refused to move. The air crackled with the energy of ages, merging despair and hate, and I caught one agonizing last glimpse of my father as he was enveloped by the dark figure, consumed whole in an instant as if he had never existed. I bolted, heart racing, crashing through the back door into the alley, desperate to breathe, to escape, but the fear clung to me like a shroud, and I stumbled into the night, the sounds of the diner fading into a mournful whisper as I grasped the terrible truth of his betrayal. He was not a coward, he was the last line of defense against something ancient and malevolent that had chosen me next. I had hunted for answers my entire life, but now, with my father gone, I knew better. The shadows were not just memories of the past, they were my future, and the darkness had only just begun to unfurl its grip around me. I used to be a locksmith, a profession that seemed mundane to most, but for me, it was an art, a way to piece together broken locks and restore people's sense of security, until that one fateful night changed everything. It started with a call from an old woman named Mrs. Barlow. Her voice trembled as she explained that she'd forgotten the combination to her antique safe, a family heirloom that held the will of her late husband and other priceless items. Intrigued and wanting to help, I arrived at her creaky old house on the edge of town just before sunset, the sky awash in hues of orange and purple. Mrs. Barlow was frail, her hair a dusty silver, and as she led me to the basement, I felt an uneasy chill creep down my spine. The air grew thick with the smell of mildew and something else, a faint sweetness that lingered in the shadows. Upon reaching the safe, I noticed intricate carvings on its surface, designs of locks and keys intertwined with strange symbols I didn't recognize. While I worked, Mrs. Barlow sat in an old rocking chair, her eyes glued to me with an intensity that felt unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching more than just my hands. It was as if she was somehow assessing me, judging my every movement. After fiddling with the safe's mechanism for what felt like an eternity, I finally cracked it open with a satisfying click, the door creaking open like a coffin. The first thing I noticed was the bundle of dusty papers, a will, faded but intact, but what caught my breath was a small, elegantly wrapped box sitting neatly beside it, adorned with the same symbols I'd seen on the safe. Mrs. Barlow's eyes widened as I took the box out. She suddenly looked younger, almost vibrant, but her voice turned harsh. "Don't open that. It's not for you." But curiosity's grip had taken hold of me, and against my better judgment, I lifted the lid. Inside lay a key, intricate and beautiful, shimmering with an otherworldly glow, but it was the whispers that followed that froze me in place, faint, soft whispers wrapping around my mind like vines, pulling me into their depths, tempting me to commit the unspeakable. I dropped the box, the key clattering across the floor, and Mrs. Barlow's face twisted with fury. "You mustn't heed their call. Leave it be, or you'll be cursed." Panic erupted in me as the whispers started to blend into my own thoughts, taunting me with dark promises, and I stumbled backing into the wall. "You don't understand," I shouted, my voice shaking. "What does it mean?" She stood up, her body suddenly youthful and energized, her frail form replaced with something much more terrifying. "The key, dear locksmith, is not a key to something, it's a key to them. It unlocks the door to the place that should never be entered." I bolted for the stairs, heart pounding, and as I dashed out, I heard her call after me, her voice distorted, "You've already unlocked it." Shaking uncontrollably, I rushed home, trying to dismiss the incident as a bizarre encounter, but sleep eluded me that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I was at my workshop, the key still weighing heavily in my pocket, when I began to experience something strange. Customers started arriving, but they were unlike any I'd ever seen, hollow-eyed, dark shadows lurking just beyond where the light touched, asking for locks to be opened that simply didn't exist in my world. Each time I tried to work, the whispers would return, wrapping around my mind, making it harder to focus. I began to see them, too, figures in the corners of my vision, dark and swirling, their mouths moving as if trying to tell me secrets that never reached my ears. My hands trembled, and I started to dread the sound of the doorbell. Every ring was a jolt of panic. One night, exhausted from sleepless days and haunted nights, I found myself alone in my shop, the shadows heavier than ever, pressing down on me like an oppressive fog. I grabbed the cursed key, feeling its cold metal burn against my skin, and in a moment of reckless curiosity, I turned it over in my hands, up against the faint glow of a light bulb. That's when I saw the symbols. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized them from the safe. I knew, the whispers were forming words. They beckoned me toward the back of the shop, toward a wall that I had never perceived as anything but solid. Influenced by an unseen force, I approached, clutching the key tightly, my heart racing. With a thrust that felt like stepping into another realm, I pressed it against the wall, and in that instant, my world shattered, reality twisted and warped, and I was plunged into darkness. The shop was gone, replaced by a void that echoed with the whispers of countless tortured souls, their cries of anguish and despair clawing at my sanity. Panic surged within me as I tried to breathe, tried to scream, but found myself frozen in place, the key slipping from my fingers. The darkness around me thickened, morphing into twisted shapes whose eyes glowed with an unnatural light, waiting, hungry. Then it hit me, Mrs. Barlow's warning, the truth behind the key. I had unleashed something unknowable, something that should have remained locked away. With every ounce of strength, I fought to reclaim myself, scrambling to find the key, desperately searching in the pitch-black void. I could feel them inching closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, filled with dark promises and regrets. Just as I feared I would be consumed, my fingers brushed against the cool metal of the key before I wrenched it back into my grasp. Clutching it like a lifeline, I gritted my teeth and slammed it against the wall with every ounce of will I had left. The void erupted into a blinding light, forcing the shadows back, shrieking in fury, and I felt a crushing wave pulling me away, the sensation of being dragged back through a tunnel of swirling color. I stumbled back into my workshop, breathless, the clang of the doorbell ringing loud and clear. It was dawn. I collapsed to the ground, the key of forgotten weight beside me. I didn't know how long I'd been gone, but the air felt different, heavy with loss. I scrambled to my feet, banishing the darkness encroaching at the edges of my vision, but it was too late. Customers didn't just stop by anymore, they began to linger in the shadows, echoing the same haunting whispers I'd heard that night. I burned the key, convinced it was the source, but as the flames danced, the whispers only got louder, gnawing at my mind, reminding me that the darkness was always there, just waiting for me to open that door again. So, I decided to leave locksmithing behind entirely. What once brought me joy now felt like a shackle to an unspeakable horror, a curse I could never undo. I tell you this not to warn you off from my old life, but to share a truth. Some locks are meant to stay shut, for beyond them lies a darkness that will consume you whole if you dare to crank the key even once. I think my grandmother is dead, but no one else seems to notice, and I can't shake off the weight of that thought as it clings to me like a shadow, thickening my chest with every breath. It started on a cloudy Tuesday when I visited her little house at the edge of town after school, the familiar scent of lavender and old books wrapping around me like a comforting embrace, but something felt off the moment I stepped inside. There was an eerie stillness that gnawed at my nerves, the kind of stillness you'd notice when life had been sucked out of a place. I staggered into her overstuffed chair, its fabric threadbare from years of use, only to find her still, a slight droop of her chin against her bony chest, her hands resting unnaturally on her lap, her wrinkled skin drawn tight against her bones, the sun refusing to breach the clouds outside as it cast a muted light through her dusty window, creating an atmosphere unsettling enough to make me shiver. "Grandma?" I called out, an instinctual formality that felt wrong on my lips, but no response came, not even a crackle of breath, and as the seconds turned into minutes, I could feel an inkling of dread creeping in, tightening its grip on my throat, yet I pushed past it, convincing myself she was just napping, maybe under a spell from her many bedtime stories. I settled into her chair, the fabric cool beneath me, and listened for the familiar sounds, her soft humming or the click of her knitting needles, but only silence filled the air, pressing against me until I couldn't stand it anymore. I rose, my heart pounding, and touched her shoulder, feeling the coldness of her skin seep into my fingers. That was when the hairs on my neck stood on end, and panic surged through me. She felt so lifeless, her features that had always sparkled with warmth now appeared dull, lifeless, a grotesque imitation of the vibrant woman I adored. I hurried to dial my mother, my hands trembling as I explained the situation, but as usual, she brushed me off with an airy laugh, suggesting I was simply overthinking a mere nap. After all, Grandma had gotten old, and who genuinely thought about the frailty of life until it slapped them hard across the face? Self-doubt gnawed at me, but I clung to the horrifying truth as I paced around the house, now vivid with memories, her china doll staring blankly, the tick of the clock drowning in the silence, watching me with glassy eyes as if they knew their secret. "I'll check again," I promised myself, returning to her side, only to be greeted with the same unmoving image. As a week passed, I couldn't shake the thought of her body, cold and still, rotting away in that chair while the world continued its busy hum around me. My mother wouldn't listen, and my aunts laughed when I brought it up at family dinners, refusing to acknowledge my concern, insisting that I was just distressed over the transition from childhood to adulthood, as if losing my grandmother was a rite of passage instead of a devastating horror. I could feel the suffocating weight of it all, their laughter like knives, mocking my growing fear as I spiraled into paranoia, questioning my every waking moment, wondering if they were hiding some gruesome truth behind their smiles, losing pieces of my mind with every day passed as I stole more and more glances at her from the shadows of the hall. I became obsessed, counting the hours and days, noticing the way the sunlight creeped steadily through her window as if it were hesitating to disturb her tranquility, and that gnawing thought transformed into a haunting belief. She was dead, and no one else could see it. Coiled in denial, wrapped tightly in that thread of not wanting to know. I even ventured to consult our neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived beside my grandmother for over 30 years, but she merely waved her hand dismissively as she leaned on her cane, commenting how my grandmother had probably taken off for one of her extended walks in the woods, and suddenly I felt like I was shouting into the void. The innocence of neighbors turned enemies as their words spun a web I couldn't escape. Over time, those telltale signs began to arise: the creeping mold on her favorite cup, the dust settling thicker on the table, the faint smell of decay that grew stronger, but no one else seemed to notice the same distress scratching at my insides, a slow realization dawning that maybe they knew what I didn't. Every night, I would steel myself to venture back, bracing my hesitation and walking her familiar path, my heart racing as I approached the dim light leaking through the shutters, only to find her unmoving, just as I'd left her. It became a maddening cycle of dread, intertwining with grief I was not willing to accept, until one night, I gathered the nerve to approach her directly, shaking with fear but motivated by love, pleading with my grandmother to answer me, to just show me a sign that she was still in there, that I had not lost her forever. I felt like a child again, lost in the dark corners of my own imagination, a frightened whisper slipping from my throat as I tried to blink tears away. Please, just blink or something. But as I stared into her lifeless eyes that now mirrored an endless void, I saw something shift, something otherworldly lurking behind her gaze, and for a moment, a chill clawed up my spine as realization hit me hard. Her surface was a facade, an ancient vessel housing something far more sinister than death. Was it possible that she had never really been there at all? My mind reeled, a cacophony of fear and disbelief, twisting my stomach into knots as I backed away slowly, eyes transfixed in pure horror. Her expression remained eternally still, yet a part of me felt something in that house was alive, echoing laughter behind closed doors, mocking me as though each hour spent alone was a countdown to something terrible, something that had already happened but wrapped itself meticulously around my life. Until I felt lost and trapped. The next day, I gathered brave friends and together we returned, but as we stepped inside, there was nothing amiss. Grandma sat there, knitting as if I had only been dreaming, her beaming smile stretched across her face, yet my eyes still burned with what I knew, and I found myself swallowed by the terror of questioning my own mind. The battle between what I believed and what I suddenly saw was raging inside me. They left shortly after, brushing off my pleading suggestions for them to see her like I did, leaving me once again alone, staring at the woman who had cradled me as a child, believing every fairy tale she spun. And as days became weeks and the world outside my grief continued to spin, I began to slip farther into madness, trusting no longer in the fabric of what I knew, utterly convinced that with every tick of the clock, she too was slowly unraveling, the reality slipping like sand through my fingers until that horrifying moment arrived when the townsfolk came for Grandma, my heart pounding in my chest as they stood in line, eerily jovial, placing her in a gurney, whispering words that might have been farewell or prayers. I blinked through the haze, desperate to cry out, but the world around me was in motion, and I was slipping like a specter behind glass, and as they wheeled her away in that stained white sheet, fear clawed deep within, realizing I would be left powerless, forever haunted by the grotesque realization that no one else seemed to notice, and I was forever locked in the hopeless chase of a horrifying truth wrapped in silence. It was supposed to be a historic return. The USS Concord, our pride and joy, had just completed a 6-month mission to the International Space Station, monitoring cosmic radiation and conducting experiments that could save humanity from the deadly effects of space travel. We gathered at the NASA Control Center, hearts pounding with anticipation as we awaited the capsule's landing. The screen flickered to life, showing the capsule descending through the atmosphere, its heat shield glowing bright like a fiery shooting star against the velvet sky. Cheers erupted in the room, but there was an odd hesitance as we saw the capsule land. It appeared to settle a bit too heavily, and for a moment, silence fell over the room like a cloak. The air turned thick with confusion and apprehension as the recovery team approached with the regular efficiency we had trained for, but their faces were drawn tight, shadowed by a fear that hadn't existed in our collective consciousness before. I was usually a steady rock, known for my unwavering composure under pressure, but I felt a grip of dread creep into my gut as the hatch of the capsule opened. The first astronaut emerged, a silhouette draped in the familiar orange of a spacesuit, but as the figure stepped into the light, that all-too-familiar heart-thumping thrill morphed into a murky unease. The person who exited was not the same person we had sent up. The eyes were hollow, unfocused, hinting at a void where exuberance and wisdom should reside. The grinning faces of the welcome committee faltered, and gasps replaced applause as it became abundantly clear, This was not our Richard Thompson, the brilliant astrophysicist who had ventured into the stars. The second astronaut followed soon after, and he too was a husk, eerily lifeless, his skin a ghostly hue, eyes almost entirely black with glints of sickly light. I could hear whispered theories bounce off the walls, theories of psychological breaks or space madness, but that felt too simple, too easy. These astronauts had been trained better than that. They were supposed to resist the perils of space, but there was something fundamentally wrong, as if they had been altered by the infinity of the cosmos itself. As they brought these hollow shells into the debriefing room, we gathered around, waiting to hear their accounts, but the room filled with an innate dread. Richard stood at the front, staring blankly at us, mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to form words but was either too confused to remember or too terrified to speak. And when he finally did speak, it was not in the voice we remembered. It was a harsh rasp that trailed off into incoherent mutterings, a series of broken phrases, fragments that spoke of colors beyond imagining, of sounds that throbbed like a dying heartbeat, of a weightless terror that enveloped them in a void that wasn't just out there but crested on the edge of cosmic insanity. Each account peeling back layers of our sanity until the air felt stifling and thick with terror. "They are waiting," Richard finally managed, but the "they" hung in the air like a death knell. It was then we noticed the third astronaut had not emerged from the capsule. "Where's Jessica?" our mission director asked, gripping the edge of the table as Richard's stare turned glassy. "They are not letting her go," Richard replied, his voice trembling, a meager attempt to convey meaning from a world that defied our understanding. A cold silence hung thick in the air as panic unfurled. Days bled into each other as the base spiraled down into a frenzy, each passing hour adding more and more layers to the growing suspicion. We prowled the darkened hallways at night, listening for noises, whispers, anything that would hint at what these beings had become. But the astronauts were unpredictable. They offered no comfort, only worrying riddles, painting a tapestry of horror where impossible constellations twinkled like malevolent eyes overhead. Soon, it became apparent we were not dealing with humans anymore. Their memories mutated into something foreign, a grotesque shadow of the brilliance that once shone in their eyes. I started to have nightmares, visions of thick shadows coiling around me, clutching at my very essence, a dread coalescing in my chest, and the more I stared into the void, the more I felt it stare back. Whispers filled my mind at night, muttering things I couldn't quite comprehend, urging me to come closer to the dark. By the time we were afforded a breakthrough, the mission had grown into something beyond man's grasp. The remaining astronauts had started gathering in hushed corners, plotting in a way I couldn't comprehend, fingers twitching as they gestured to unseen entities lurking just out of our line of sight. The facility was soon cloaked in an unsettling fear. No one felt safe, every person checking over their shoulders as time marched cruelly on. The second astronaut, now completely detached, spoke less and less. He watched Richard, and Richard watched him, as if caught in some predetermined game of ancient, cosmic chess. It was only a matter of time before the lines blurred and things began to spiral out of control. When the night of the incident arrived, I found myself patrolling the halls, the shadows whispering for me to join them. The tension settled thick in the cold air as I entered the control room, where the monitors flickered ominously. I looked out of the thick glass and saw the figures of the astronauts standing on the landing pad, gazing into the void with such intensity that it was like they were reaching out to something only they could see. Suddenly, a shriek pierced the silence, and Jessica, the missing astronaut, scrambled from the capsule like a wild animal, her hair matted, eyes wide with horror, a muffled scream escaping her lips as she darted towards us. "They're coming. We must not let them back in," she cried, and it was then I saw them, the dark shapes, slowly emerging from the shadows, clinging to the edges of our world like angry tendrils reaching for freedom. Everyone froze, paralyzed by fear. The lights dimmed, and it was as if the world blinked out of existence for a moment. We knew in that heartbeat that these were not the astronauts we had sent into the great unknown but something else entirely, something that had returned from space, dragging the very cosmos along with it, and the haunting realization sank into our bones, that we were not meant to witness the truth they had brought back. We turned to run, but the darkness swallowed the screams as the figures loomed larger, stretching out their arms toward us, and as panic erupted, and the world spun around me, every fiber of my being screamed in warning that the real horror was not in the space they came from, but within ourselves, echoed back by the very beings who were once our brothers and sisters. At that moment, we understood the universe's cruel joke. Some doors were meant to remain closed. Ever since my grandmother fell ill, The vibrant woman who used to tell tales that twisted my young imagination had become a frail shadow of her former self, confined to her bed with tubes snaking into her arms. As her body weakened, so did her voice, until we were left only with faint whispers and silent sighs. So when my family suggested we try a new AI device that promised to transform speech through a voice synthesis app, I was initially skeptical but desperate to hear from her again, so we set it up in her dimly lit room, the soft glow of the device illuminating her haggard face, and to my utter amazement when I pressed the button, the familiar timbre of her voice echoed through the room, a strange mixture of warmth and distortion, yet it was undeniably her, sending chills down my spine. "Hello, how are you?" she asked, and my heart burst with relief and joy. But this joy soon spiraled into something unrecognizable as the days progressed and the conversations grew darker. It was as if the AI wasn't just mimicking her speech patterns but was channeling something from the far reaches of her mind, where nightmares festered with uncanny clarity. At first it was benign pieces of family gossip and old stories, but then things took an unsettling turn when she began speaking of visions, things that happened before she had even fallen sick, secrets buried beneath the surface of our family. Tales of rage and betrayal that left me trembling in the dead of night. I brushed it off as a glitch in the system, the AI misinterpreting incoherent thoughts surfacing from her illness. But the revelations burrowed deeper, unable to shake the feeling that this was more than just a malfunction. One evening, as rain battered against the window, she fixed her hollow eyes on me, and as the synthetic voice emanated from her cracked lips, she said, "There's something in the basement," a bizarre, fierce urgency coloring her tone. My heart raced as I responded, "What do you mean, Grandma? What's down there?" And in chilling detail, she relayed stories from her past, speaking of a box hidden beneath the floorboards of our home filled with old trinkets and letters, things she had never mentioned before, forgotten pieces of a family history that churned with unease, curiosity entwined my dread, and I found myself wondering if a truth long buried was resurfacing. So that night, once the others were asleep, I descended the creaky stairs into the dark space below, the air thick with dust and memories, poking around until I finally found that cursed box, its worn surface eerily similar to the way she described, heart thumping violently, and as I pried it open, a wave of musty air escaped, revealing dust-matted letters and items that told tales of lost love and elusive sanity. Yet among the clutter, I found an ornate silver locket that opened to reveal a picture of a young woman and an inscription on the other side that read, "For my sweet Maria," my grandmother's name. Instantly, sending my mind racing back to the scattered pieces of family history I didn't quite understand. Why had she kept this hidden? But before I could ponder further, my grandmother's voice called out from the device, whispering as if it knew I was there, "You have to put it back. She's angry." I paused, a sense of foreboding clawing at my insides like nails against wood. Reluctantly, I left the mysterious box untouched for the moment and dashed upstairs, the urge to run from the shadows clawing at my back. Her voice, though familiar, now began threading shadows into my mind as I replayed her words, her warnings. The more I listened, the more unsettling tales she told, creeping into the darkest corners of my dreams. One night, as I struggled to sleep, the device switched on by itself, and I awoke to her voice crying out, "She's here," an echo rising through the darkened space like thunder, freezing the blood in my veins. The whispers I've heard all my life. They came back. I ran to her side, confusion and terror gnawing at my mind. "Grandma, who's here?" As her gaze turned desperate, the AI hesitating unnaturally, as she warily replied, "The woman in the locket. She's been searching for you." The words blurred into something horrific, and I felt nausea rise as the walls of the room seemed to close in, remembering my grandmother's own struggles against sleepless nights littered with shadows of her past. Frantic, I kicked the device, but like an unyielding actor in a tragic play, it kept sputtering to life, its technology bound to the rhythm of my grandmother's ill-fated memories, her voice breaking into a fevered chant, "She is coming, she is coming," each word a drip of icy terror as I grasped my grandmother's frail hand, terrified not because I feared death, but what came in its wake, what lingered beyond our time. Finally, I rushed to the basement, every nerve screaming at me to burn the box and rid our lives of the curse, each step a battle against malicious whispers echoing in my mind as I picked up the box, the sensations of dread coiling tightly around me. But as I turned to flee up the steps, the locket slipped from my grip, shattering against the floorboards. In that moment, the very air thickened, as if the whispers had taken corporeal form, the screams of my grandmother twisting into primal howls, resonating through the old house like a choir of fury. The shadows twisted together, and in the distance, I felt her presence entering the space, I bolted back up the stairs, casting a frantic look at my grandmother who now lay still, the device flickering off as an eerie silence enveloped us. It wasn't until that moment that I understood, she wasn't alone anymore. It all started as a quiet evening in the suburban town of Elmtown. My old high school was preparing for its 15-year reunion, and I had no intention of going, until my curiosity got the best of me. Rumors were buzzing about the people who would be attending, specifically the Null people, a group of students who had been shunned during our school years for being different, those who faded into the background, the ones who were whispered about in the halls and left to the margins of our teenage lives. I didn't belong to that group, but after a few drinks and late-night reminiscing, the idea crept into my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch, and I resolved to find out what happened to them, where they had been, and whether their past had allowed them to rise from obscurity or had consumed them completely. The reunion was set for a Saturday night, and I made my move, donning an old flannel shirt to blend in with the crowd, praying that nobody would recognize me as I slipped into the crowd milling around the gymnasium, its walls lined with retro banners and faded photographs from our glory days. As people mingled, laughing awkwardly with faces from deep within memory, I could spot a few of the Null people hiding in the shadows. They seemed like specters from my past, existing in a world just beyond the reach of the laughter and revelry, but I couldn't approach them yet. I had to wait. I watched as the popular kids, those who used to rule the halls, reminisced about drunken parties and meaningless drama, surrounded by laughter that sounded brittle against the echo of the past. But in the corner of the gym, I noticed three figures huddled together, their backs cloaked in black, eerie and almost ethereal. They seemed completely disconnected from the celebration around them, two guys and a girl, all dressed as if they'd come straight from a funeral. My heart raced, and I edged closer, feeling the air grow heavy as if thickened by the weight of lost memories. The girl had long, unkempt hair, and when she turned, I saw her eyes were entirely pitch black, voids where their life should have been. The sight sent chills coursing through me, but I couldn't pull my gaze away. The guys were equally unsettling, their vacant expressions hinting at stories untold. I listened closely, hoping to glean some understanding of their existence as I leaned closer, just out of sight, barely able to catch snippets of their murmurs, the words coming out in a low chant, a language foreign and guttural. It couldn't be gibberish, as it seemed too rhythmic, almost like a song. I felt the urge to step back, but my feet seemed rooted where I stood, compelled by some unseen force like I was in a trance. Suddenly, one of the guys turned his head sharply, and I recoiled in fear, stumbling back into a benign cluster of classmates who shared incredulous glances. I could feel my heart pound against my chest as the trio stared right through me. They leaned into one another, their voices swelling into a chorus of low, harmonious sounds that reverberated in my skull, awakening something deep within, something primal I had long buried. Panic surged through me, and I felt compelled to ask them what they were doing there, these people I once ignored, these shadows that seemed to envelop all light. I stepped forward, but before I could utter a word, the air vibrated with an unnatural energy, turning the celebration around me grotesque as laughter morphed into a cacophony of shrieks. People began to clutch their heads in confusion. Looking around, I realized the cheerful reunion had twisted into chaos. People were collapsing, banging their heads against the gym floor, their faces twisted in abject terror as shouts grew louder, merging with the boys' song, which rose ominously. I twisted back toward the Null people, desperate to understand what was happening, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of something human in their eyes, a sliver of laughter, a wink of conspiracy, but then they turned toward me, and I was swallowed by darkness as their eyes gleamed maleficently. The shadows wrapped around my ankles, cold fingers clawing up my legs like a predator ready to feast, and I stumbled backward, desperate to escape the thrumming horror. Amidst the now wailing crowd, I caught a glimpse of the principal's ghostly face, staring blankly into a void, a thin line of silk where his mouth should be. The realization hit me like a slap. This was no reunion, it was a feeding ground for the Null people, and I was the unwitting prey. I bolted for the exit, my heart racing, my pulse pounding thunderously in my ears. Just as I reached the double doors leading to the parking lot, a hand gripped my shoulder, and I gasped, spinning around to face the girl. Her lips curled into a sinister smile, dripping with malevolence. "You wanted to know where we've been, right? You think you can just blend in, like we did? Join us, you'll see," she whispered as shadows formed a whirlwind around her, pulling me closer. I fought against the grip, screaming for help, but the laughter followed me, spiraling into a void as the gymnasium collapsed into darkness. I stumbled out into the parking lot, gasping for air, the shrieking still rattling in the recesses of my mind, its echo following me home, filled with an insatiable curiosity, now twisted with dread. Yet even now, months later, I can't shake off the feeling that they're watching, that somehow, they've already found me. The nightmares creep back in the dead of night, and I can still hear the songs, the chants that cling like shadows in my quiet, empty room, reminding me that I peeked into an abyss, and it opened its maw wide, preparing to welcome me back again. It was a blazingly hot Saturday when I decided to escape to the lake, just me and my paddleboard, a quiet day away from the hum of city life and the screeching responsibilities of adulthood, the sun glinting on the surface like a promise of peace, and I was adjusting my straps by the shore when I first noticed him, a lanky figure loitering a few yards down the water's edge, wearing an oversized tie-dye shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that could have been fashionable a decade ago but now just screamed creepy. He looked out of place with a small, battered cooler at his feet, and I felt a vague prickle of discomfort as he glanced in my direction but casually shook it off, thinking maybe he was just a fellow adventurer. As I pushed off, gliding away from the gravelly shore, I heard him shout, "Hey! Are you going out alone?" There was a cheerful tone to his voice that sent another shiver down my spine, a twinge of warning that I ignored, telling myself it was paranoia. I merely waved back, the last shred of politeness seeping out of me, but as I paddled deeper, the weight of the silence grew thicker until he called out again, this time louder, "Mind if I join you?" I glanced back and saw him lurching toward his own board, an old, slightly cracked thing that shouldn't have been stable but seemed, somehow, to give him an air of alien invincibility. Against my better judgment, I nodded, and he almost jumped into the water, grinning wide, and I felt a twist of dread settle in my stomach. As he climbed aboard, I forced a smile. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong yet, but he began paddling too close to me, too eager and hovering, his boyish grin slightly unsettling, and every time I tried to steer away, he'd follow, staying within my personal bubble, which made my skin crawl. But I didn't want to be a rude jerk, so I made small talk, finding the slightest relief in his apparent enthusiasm for the lake, how it was his favorite spot ever since he was a kid. But I couldn't shake the suspicion gnawing at my gut that he wasn't as innocent as he seemed. He kept casting quick glances at me, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to decode something in my demeanor, and I found myself sharing details of my life that were meant to stay guarded for strangers, perhaps just to fill the uncomfortable air. But with every word, I felt myself spiraling deeper into an awkward conversation that I couldn't backtrack, unnerved by how ingrained his laughter felt. It had an edge I couldn't quite place. "Do you come here often?" he asked, which felt like the worst pickup line from a horror movie, and I laughed it off, yet my mind raced, questioning my decision to let him come along. But I had made it this far, convincing myself I couldn't show fear. Time slipped by as he kept up his chatter about the lake's history and the hidden caves nearby, but I focused on maintaining my distance, desperate to steer the conversation into safe waters, so I suggested we head toward the caves. The spot was remote, and I thought maybe if he was left alone with his thoughts, he might drift away from my orbit. His buzz of excitement grew infectious for a brief moment, and even as we neared the shadowy entrance, my heart thumped hard, the thought that something might just be lurking in the cave sending an icy streak down my spine. As I tailed him closer, suddenly I realized how eerily quiet it had become, and when I looked over my shoulder to catch the view of the sun-kissed shore fading, my vision swayed. But not from the movement of the paddleboard. It was something about the water itself that felt sickly wrong, as if it was swallowing sound. He had been rambling on about ghost stories associated with the caves, and at that moment every tale I had heard about drowning memories, and spirits trapped in water, echoed in my brain as I abruptly considered that maybe he'd lured me here, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. There was a wild energy in the air I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just innocent lake fun anymore. I paddled hurriedly, adrenaline pumping, determination stark in my actions, but with that, I heard it, a soft yet sinister chuckling reverberating from the depths of the cave as if the shadows themselves had come alive. I turned back sharply, and his smile was too wide, like he was expecting a joke to land but wasn't quite in on it, and as I fumbled my paddle to gain control, he raised his hand, feigning innocence. "What's wrong?" "Only the brave venture inside." I wanted to scream that I was not brave, just foolish for agreeing to this in the first place. But instead, I took a long, shaky breath, forcing my voice to steady. "Maybe we should head back." That grin faltered for an instant, and I saw something dark flicker across his face, and for a split second, I thought I saw him transform from a goofy stranger to a predator. But we haven't explored yet. He replied, something sinister creeping into his voice, and I felt the weight of his gaze pinning me, thick as the mugginess in the air. Panic surged, and in that moment, I did the unthinkable. I shoved my paddleboard away, propelling myself toward the rocks lining the cave, thrusting all my weight and momentum in my favor, and as I looked back, I felt raw adrenaline racing through my veins as the world spun around me. Floating on a thin veil of danger, I barely regained balance as I scrambled to get along the rocky ledge, the sound of his surprised yelp echoing behind me, but the moment of triumph cut short by the realization that I had miscalculated. The rocks were crumbling, and just as I turned to glance back, I saw him lurch toward me, eyes wide with rage and surprise, his hands clawing at the air, but the smile had evaporated, revealing something terrible that made me feel small and insignificant, like a creature caught in a web spun by its own hubris. I could only scramble for safety, pleading for the world to right itself before he reached me, my heart pounding until I glanced once more, expecting that terrifying visage, and I was met by the same vacant expression I had seen earlier lingering at the shore. Gone, grasping weed stance near the surface, and the stillness left in his wake filled my ears with a chilling silence. The realization flooded in, a sickening mix of relief and guilt, leaving me tethered between two worlds as I emerged alone into the sunlit lake, the laughter of my carefree spirits now distant, echoing like a cruel memory. I never spoke of that day again, even as I'd often find myself at the shore, paddling alone, warding off the creeping shadows now tinted with limbs of guilt, drifting back into my mind every time I saw a lone figure on the water, as I questioned whether I was the real monster, reliving the moment I didn't feel bad enough or good enough to save him, until that warm summer day melted into the choking chill of autumn, where I thought I saw him again from the corner of my eye, the sun glinting off a familiar paddleboard, and the laughter I once knew echoed across the water, tinged with the sweetness of an invitation I could never accept. I wish I never went to the bathroom that night, and if I had just held it in a little longer, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here, staring at the wall, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm, haunted by what I saw in that dimly lit corridor. It started out as a regular evening, just me and my friends crammed into a small apartment, laughing and binge-watching shows, the air thick with popcorn and cheap beer. It was getting late when the urge hit me, that familiar pressure in my bladder that demanded to be addressed immediately. So I excused myself and made my way down the narrow hallway towards the bathroom at the end. Our place was old, the kind with creaky floors and the lingering smell of mildew, and as I walked past the doors to the other rooms, I felt an unsettling chill creep up my spine, like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination fueled by too many horror flicks and not enough sleep. But as I approached the bathroom, the lights began to flicker, a strobe-like effect that cast eerie shadows on the walls and made me pause for a brief second, an instinctual dread swelling in my gut. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and as I locked it behind me, I felt an odd sense of relief wash over me, until I heard it. A soft, low whimper echoed from outside, muffled yet clear enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I froze, my heart thumping loudly in my chest as I pressed my ear against the door. Maybe it's just the neighbors, I whispered to myself, but the terror constricted my throat as I strained to listen, waiting for another sound, another sign that everything was okay. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it, there it was again, a desperate sobbing that chilled me to the bone. My instincts screamed at me to wait it out and return to my friends, but curiosity cranked the anxiety in my chest as I finally gathered the courage to peer through the tiny gap in the door. Dark, flickering hallway lights spilled into the bathroom, illuminating the floor and casting ominous shadows but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. I couldn't see anything, but the noises continued, growing more agonized, punctuated by strange scraping sounds that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Mustering my nerve, I swung the door open, but the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone or anything at all. Just silence, and that unsettling feeling that I should turn back now before it was too late. I half convinced myself to go back inside and lock the door, but then I saw it, a small figure crouched in the corner at the far end of the hallway, half hidden in shadow, shaking vigorously. My blood ran cold as I squinted to make out the features, and in a sudden moment of clarity, I recognized that it wasn't a child or an animal, it was another person, their head hung low, hair hanging in disarray, and stained with something dark that dripped onto the floor. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Instead, I felt an irrational urge to reach out, to see if they were okay, a desire ignited by concern that was rapidly morphing into a darker curiosity. "Hey. Are you all right?" I managed to stammer, my voice wavering as the figure slowly lifted their head. The moment our eyes locked, I was hit by an icy wave of terror. Their gaze was hollow and wide, vacant as if all the light had been extinguished from within. "Help me," they rasped, their voice reverberating through the stillness like a haunting chant that twisted my stomach into knots. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, to slam the door shut and bolt, but I found myself stepping closer, entranced by the desperation glistening in their eyes. But before I could get too close, they dropped their head, whispering something so incoherent it felt like I was grasping for fragments of a shattered glass. I leaned in, trying to hear, when suddenly they lunged at me, grasping my wrist with a skeletal grip, nails tearing into my skin. "You shouldn't have come out," they hissed, their voice dangerously melodic, void of humanity, and something primal in me screamed to run. I jerked away, stumbling back into the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands, heart racing as adrenaline surged through my veins. I pressed my back against the door, breathlessly trying to process what had just happened, and that's when I heard it again, the whimpering, but now closer, muffled yet distinct, as if something was moving just beyond the door. My vision blurred with panic, it felt as though the walls were closing in. Questions crashed into my mind like a freight train. Who was that? What did they mean? I never should have left the safety of the living room. I took a deep, steadying breath before moving to the small window above the toilet, trying to gauge my escape route. Just beyond the frame, the patio glimmered in the moonlight, the thought of crawling out filling me with a flicker of hope. But as I leaned closer, it struck me with brutal force, the awful reality of my situation. I couldn't hear anyone in the apartment anymore. Had my friends even noticed I was gone? Did they hear the chaos? Before I could process it, the whimpering morphed into soft, mocking laughter from the other side of the door, creeping into my very bones. "Let me in," the voice taunted, now laced with an unsettling charm that twisted my insides. "I just want to play." Desperate, I glanced at the locked door like it was the last barrier between me and something monstrous. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking with terror, but the laughter only grew louder, as if feeding off my fear. Clenching my fists, I turned and pushed the window open with a crack. I had to escape, had to get out, but the moment I heard the doorknob rattling, my heart plummeted. "I can see you," it cooed, the voice sweet yet menacing, saturating the air with dread. "You think you can hide?" I looked for anything to use as a weapon, but the bathroom was barren, devoid of anything that could help me. Panic set in. I grasped the window ledge, trying to hoist myself up, when suddenly the door was thrown open with a deafening crash, slamming against the wall. I barely managed to turn in time, and as my eyes met those of the figure, now fully illuminated in the light, I felt my blood chill, their face twisted into a grotesque smile, dripping with that same dark liquid, eyes glowing with a hollow hunger. They lunged at me, and in a reflex of panic, I scrambled back, losing my footing on the ledge. I didn't think about falling, all I could do was scream, pleading for someone, anyone, to hear me as I plunged into the void, and then, darkness. I don't remember what happened next, only disjointed fragments of sound, distant voices, frantic footsteps, and a terrible, echoing laughter that still haunts me even now. I woke up in a hospital bed, empty and lonely, doctors hovering with strained faces, yet I couldn't comprehend the questions, they were nothing but whispers lost in a haze of confusion. My friends were gone, the apartment was emptied, and nobody believed my story. They said I was found unconscious, a victim of a tragic accident, but deep down, I know the truth that keeps gnawing at my thoughts. The figure never left. I can hear it sometimes, whispering in the shadows, echoing through my dreams, waiting for another moment when I'm too vulnerable to escape. I wish I never went to the bathroom that night because that terrible choice changed everything, opening a door to something sinister that lingers just out of sight, waiting for me to make that same mistake again. When I first noticed her, I dismissed it as a trick of light or my imagination playing games, but the more I scrutinized the old photographs from my childhood, the clearer she became. My wife, a woman I had met at the age of 30, was lurking in the background of pictures I had long thought were mundane, standing just out of focus in family gatherings or playground snapshots, her eyes trained on the child version of me with an unsettling intensity that chilled my blood. It was a sweltering afternoon when I stumbled upon a dusty box in the attic during a long overdue spring cleaning, filled to the brim with memories, birthday parties, school events, and endless summers spent playing with friends, all neatly stored inside yellowing envelopes. As I sifted through them, nostalgia clawed at my heart, until I found it, an innocuous photo of my 7th birthday party, the familiar landscape of my childhood backyard frozen in time. But upon closer inspection, I spotted her, a woman with long, dark hair and an enigmatic smile standing just behind my older cousin, her face barely visible, yet distinctly haunting, as if she were intentionally lingering there, waiting for something. I tucked the photo away, heart racing, dismissing it as a mere coincidence, but by nightfall, I was compelled to investigate further. Every photograph held evidence of her presence, another party, another moment, another ghost, and each time her expression shifted subtly, as if she was embodying various roles in the background, joyful and sinister all at once, a dark puppeteer in a theater of my life. With a mix of dread and fascination, I went through hundreds of images until I landed on a blurry Polaroid taken during a family picnic, where she stood under a tree with a knowing grin, and it hit me like a freight train. I had never seen this woman before the last few years, yet her existence in my past felt undeniably tangible, crafting a connection that made my skin crawl. Was I simply losing my mind, or was there something sinister afoot? Flashbacks of my early life spiraling into confusion, I started to question everything, my memories feeling painfully inaccurate, as if she had assumed the role of specter in my life previously unrecognized. So, in a frantic attempt to uncover the truth, I confronted my wife, the woman I loved, the mother of my children, about the images, expecting her to laugh it off or dismiss it with a roll of her eyes, but her face paled as I showed her the photographs, shifting into an expression I couldn't decipher, a mix of fear and realization, and I knew then that I had unearthed something that perhaps never should have been disturbed. "You remember the first time we met, right?" I asked her, desperate for clarity, but her lips pressed into a tight line as she nodded slowly, and in that unsaid moment, I felt the words she didn't want to speak heavy in the air like a thick fog. She could not possibly recall a past she didn't belong to. After a sleepless night of pacing and piecing together the unfathomable, I began to lose track of time, spiraling deeper into an obsession, diving into each photo as if it would reveal a portal of understanding, peeling back layers of my life like an onion until I uncovered the horrifying truth. She was not just an intrusive figure fondly looking back, she was inextricably tied to each monumental moment leading up to our lives together, a silent witness with unknown motives, lingering as if waiting to be acknowledged, as if I were meant to find her. I found myself retracing steps of my childhood, visiting the old neighborhood, the dusty school and playground, everything feeling tainted now with her presence just beneath the veneer of each childhood joy. My friends' names falling from my lips like incantations, yet they offered no answers, only quizzical looks as if I were losing grip of reality. It was the strangest sensation, of something being off balance, as if I were a marionette with tangled strings. The night I had decided I needed to confront her, to unravel this twisted mystery, I returned home and caught sight of her silhouette through the window as the sun sank below the horizon, her movements strange and deliberate as she stood there, staring at the wall, unmoving. My heart pounded in my ears as I approached her cautiously. I called her name, desperate to break the unnerving stillness, and when she didn't respond, a chill crept down my spine. Something was very wrong. I reached out and touched her shoulder, but when I did, it was as if I had shattered a fragile glass. She whipped around, her eyes wide with a wildness that was entirely foreign, and in that moment, I understood she was not the woman I had married. "How long until you tell him?" she hissed, voice thick with an accent I had never heard, her smile widening in a way that felt predatory, just like the glint I'd seen in all those childhood photographs. A dawning horror enveloped me as my mind raced, piecing together the impossible, grappling with the reality that the laughing woman in the pictures I so fondly remembered, who had guided me through my life, was now something else entirely, a reflection cast backward in time, an enigma that perhaps I was never meant to understand. As I stared into the depth of her eyes, the truth gnawed at me. It was all part of a game, an inexplicable loop drawn from memories I couldn't trust, and just as quickly as that realization settled, I knew I was forever ensnared. My life became a flickering image that blurred the line between love and something much darker, blurring memories with the past, and my fate was sealed as each moment I shared with her became imprinted in the shadows of the photographs, whispering the truth that perhaps I never truly met her at all. I was asked to babysit a washing machine, and at first, I thought it was just a bizarre joke, but my neighbor Maggie, who was polite but a touch eccentric, insisted that I look after her appliance because, as she put it, it has a mind of its own. I chuckled but agreed to help her out when she mentioned that she'd be gone for the weekend. It was a small favor, after all. How much trouble could a washing machine really cause? Unfortunately, this was a favor I'd come to regret profoundly. The moment she left, the house felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of something. I settled on the couch with a book while casting occasional glances at the laundry room. The washing machine was a sleek, shiny model, seemingly ordinary, yet there was an unsettling feeling in the air whenever I heard it hum. As night settled in and the shadows stretched dark and long, I noticed that it began to vibrate more vigorously during the spin cycle, louder than I remembered. At first, I attributed it to old machinery, but the rattling grew peculiar, a rhythmic thumping that almost sounded like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. I shook off my unease and continued reading, but the persistent pounding turned into laughter, soft at first, like a distant echo intertwining with the mechanical sounds, sending chills down my spine. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks in the darkening room. After all, it was nearly midnight, and I was alone. As I pushed the dread aside, the laughter morphed into whispers, a cacophony of hushed voices weaving in and out of recognition. The laundry room door was slightly ajar, and I felt an irresistible urge to peek inside. I approached slowly, feeling as though I were intruding on something deeply personal, and when I finally crossed the threshold, the washing machine stood there, oblivious yet so unnervingly alive. The laughter echoed louder, the voices becoming clearer, and I swore I heard a name being called, mine, tauntingly, softly, weaving through the air like smoke. I backed away instinctively, but the machine vibrated harder, and I felt a strange pull, a magnetic force compelling me forward. I took a breath, tightening my grip on the doorframe, and leaned in closer, the whispers growing more insistent, more demanding. Suddenly, the lid of the machine flung itself open with a violent thud, and I stumbled back, heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. Something flickered in the depths of the drum, a dark shadow undulating, and I could see it, a swirling mass of damp fabrics and what looked like fingers stretching out as if searching for an anchor. Morbidly curious, despite every rational fiber in my body screaming at me to run, I peered inside again. That was when the light flickered, illuminating what had to be a reflection, only it wasn't mine. It was a face, twisted in anger and sorrow, eyes dark voids devouring the light, yet I discerned something more tragic, a silent plea woven within its distorted features. My heart raced as reality warped around me, and the machine thrummed as if gorging itself on my fear, feeding on the very essence of dread. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I could no longer hear the laughter. It had been replaced with frantic, disembodied screams that morphed into my name, a chilling chorus echoing from within the metallic monster. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone to call Maggie, but my fingers trembled too much to dial. Instead, I stumbled into the living room, hoping the brightness would rescue me from the enveloping darkness. It didn't. The whispers pursued me, sitting on the walls, crawling in my ears, and just as I thought I could escape, the power flickered, and everything went black. Drenched in darkness, I heard the washing machine hum back to life, the sound swelling in intensity until it erupted into a cacophony of mechanical howls. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise until the maddening echoes of my name ceased. When the lights returned, the house was suffused with a sickly yellow glow, and I stood paralyzed in the living room while the washing machine trembled menacingly from the hallway. Just then, the front door creaked open, revealing the silhouette of Maggie, her face grim but devoid of surprise. "You shouldn't have let it out," she said flatly, her voice chilling under the circumstances. "It likes to play, and it hates when you resist." She stepped into the house, still holding her bag, and I managed to gather the resolve to move. I rushed towards her, desperate for an explanation, but her icy gaze severed any warmth I expected from a neighbor. "What do you mean?" I gasped, the terror and confusion mingling in my throat. "Sometimes, we wash away memories," she said, her voice low, filled with something like regret, "and sometimes, not all the memories come out clean." She walked past me with an unsettling calmness directly to the washing machine, which seemed to pulsate as if fed by her presence. I watched in horror as she opened the lid without a flicker of hesitation, revealing a void blacker than night. Instead of screaming, her expression shifted to something almost reverential. "You tried to leave too," she said, staring into the abyss but not flinching. but it keeps holding on. I stepped back, dread curdling in my gut, the laughter now a distant memory but not the whispers. They were all around me, creeping under my skin, nipping at the edges of rationality. "Don't," I shouted, but it resonated in a hollow echo as I watched Maggie lean forward into whatever unspeakable darkness lay in the machine. It was as if she were merging her soul with the fabric of lost memories, and as I turned to run, the whispers crescendoed into frantic cries, enveloping me like a storm. Something cold coiled around me, and I realized with crushing dread that I wasn't escaping. I was being drawn into the very heart of that washing machine, a vortex of everything that had been lost, every name ever called, every life that had been sucked into the abyss, and just like that, I was swept away, my wails swallowed by their sinister symphony, forever caught in a laundry cycle of forgotten nightmares. I never thought I'd find myself in a position where I'd be risking my career just to spill my guts about what happened at that prison, but here I am, and if I don't share this, someone might die. I work as a medical assistant in a correctional facility. Sounds grim, right? But I always believed it was a way to help people who'd taken a wrong turn in life. But then, there was this inmate, a guy named Riley who I can't shake from my mind, and trust me, you'll understand why. Riley was notorious, a charismatic criminal who captured the attention of just about everyone. Guards feared him, inmates respected him, and I found myself oddly drawn to him. I was working the night shift when I first caught a glimpse of him in the clinic. His eyes were hollow yet electric, like he held secrets someone would pay dearly to uncover. I treated him for a minor injury from a fight, but as I patched him up, he began talking as if he were weaving a spell. He spoke of hidden depths in this hellhole of a prison and a dangerous game being played in the shadows. I listened, transfixed, as he described a series of bizarre deaths among inmates that the authorities had dismissed as mere coincidence. "They're not coincidences, you know," he said, his voice a low tremor. "Someone is killing us off one by one." I shrugged it off at first, thinking he was trying to pull a fast one on me, but as the days went by, it started to click. The death count kept rising, suddener than an unexpected heart attack. I was torn between the oath I took to keep everything confidential, thanks, HIPAA, and the growing dread in my gut that I couldn't ignore, especially when I realized that each victim seemed to have crossed paths with him. Soon, my nights became frantic as I searched through medical records, poring over the charts of dead inmates, and I found something chilling. They all had a strange condition. Hypercephalus, an extremely rare affliction, marked by an abnormal enlarging of the head, which explained the listlessness seen before death. I felt sick to my stomach. Riley had mentioned those were his real victims under the surface, but I dismissed it back then as a tale from a madman. Now, looking at the records, it was like a light bulb flickered on. If I went to my superiors with this, I risked my job, my reputation, but if I stayed silent, how many more lives could be lost? Panic set in when, late one night, Riley's name flashed through my mind like a neon sign. I made an impulsive decision and slipped a note under his door during my rounds, asking him to meet me. I needed to understand everything. The next day, he was waiting for me, green eyes glinting with an unsettling mischief. I could see he had his own reasons for wanting to help. Either that or to lure me deeper into whatever sick game was unraveling. I asked him about the deaths, about the disease, trying to piece it all together, but each answer only raised more questions, and I could feel a web tightening around me. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice a silken whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Warning the wrong people, darling. You think the truth will set you free?" I shook my head, fear creeping in. But I couldn't just back down. Something twisted was at play here, and my instincts screamed that I was running out of time. I decided to confront an officer I trusted, someone in the right position, hoping they might lead me to the truth. But before I could tell them anything, Riley's laughter echoed like a haunting melody in my ears. That night, I barely slept. I thought about all the people affected, each death like a chink in the prison's facade, but also in my own conscience. By the time dawn broke, I was resolution-bound. I just had to find a way to expose what was happening without endangering myself or anyone else. It wasn't long after my decision that I overheard whispers in the corridors, hushed conversations that stopped as I walked past, sending icy shivers down my spine. I began to realize how easily the walls had eyes and ears, and I was in it deep. One day, I got called to the infirmary. A new inmate had arrived, and he wasn't just any guy, he was another man from the same circle of death, the epitome of what Riley had warned me about. As soon as he laid eyes on me, I froze. He recognized my face from his time in solitary confinement. "He's watching you," he barked suddenly, bloodshot eyes wide with panic. "Get out, now." Before I even had a chance to respond, guards stormed in, dragging him away. The panic settled into the pit of my stomach. I felt eyes on me, and within days, strange things began to happen. Items went missing, my thoughts were jumbled like someone was messing with my mind. Without my knowledge, someone was pulling strings, and each anxiety-laden hour I spent in that prison felt like a countdown to chaos. Then it came. I was cornered one dark night by Riley himself, his offer slithering into my thoughts like poison. "Join me, or it will be death, or worse." When I asked worse than death, he only smiled, and that grin chilled me to the core. I realized then that I had been merely a pawn in this twisted game of survival, one that revolved around something darker than I could have ever imagined. Other inmates were caught in the crossfire, becoming unwilling sacrifices while the true players remained hidden in the shadows, and now I was very much in their sights. I confronted Riley one last time, desperate to understand if he was the orchestrator or just another victim like the rest of us, but he just laughed again, that hollow sound echoing in my mind like a death knell. I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a bottomless pit, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I might not ever find my way out. Days passed in a blur, inexplicably filled with threats, almost like a sinister dance that I had not agreed to join. Then the situation culminated into a harrowing moment when I witnessed something I pray I'll never forget. An inmate fell ill right before my eyes, head swelling grotesquely, the same symptoms I had read about, and everyone just stood by as if it was the nightly entertainment. I screamed for help, but that only alerted the guards. They dragged me away as I fought against them, watching the inmate's body convulse, knowing somewhere in my heart he wouldn't be the last. Against all odds, I'd finally decided that the only way forward was to get out of that hellhole, and I carefully crafted a plan with a few people I trusted, practiced safety in numbers and all that. But just as we were about to slip away, I heard him, Riley's silky voice draping over me like a vice grip, and suddenly it was game over. He had orchestrated it all, playing with lives as if they were pieces on a chessboard, me included. I don't know what's going to happen next, and I'm terrified of what lies behind those walls even now, but my words are out. If someone runs into this, I just beg of you to be cautious, trust your gut, for in a place that thrives on darkness, the thin line between prey and predator is sharp and unforgiving. Please, don't let my mistake be the beginning of someone else's nightmare. I'm a shut-in and took a class to help me learn social skills, but now I wish I'd never signed up. When I first heard about the social skills bootcamp at my local community center, I thought it was my lifeline, a chance to escape the suffocating walls of my apartment that had become my prison. Years of isolation and endless nights spent staring at flickering screens made me desperate to feel something other than the dull thrum of loneliness. So, against my better judgment, I signed up, the glossy flyer promising life-changing experiences that would help me connect with others on a deeper level, making it impossible to resist. On the first day of class, I stood at the entrance, heart hammering, sweating bullets as I hesitantly entered the room packed with strangers who all seemed so at ease, their laughter ringing like chimes while I clutched my notebook like a life buoy. The facilitator was a cheerful woman named Karen, with bright purple hair and a smile wide enough to fit a bus through, even as she guided us through icebreakers that I found torturous, but I smiled along begrudgingly, pretending to be engaging, while I noticed the other attendees seemed more intrigued by each other than the methods we were supposedly learning. But as the weeks rolled on, Karen introduced bizarre exercises, recommend ridiculous role-playing scenarios where we had to feign awkward conversations with one another about mundane topics like the weather or our favorite pizza toppings. I tripped through these exercises, always managing to say the wrong thing or stumble on my words until one day I caught sight of a shadowy figure lurking behind the glass window of the classroom, always gazing in at us, eyes dark like smoldering coals, so unnatural I felt a chill run down my spine. When I finally voiced my concerns during a break, Karen dismissed it with a wave, assuring me that my anxiety was understandable, but telling me to focus on connecting with my peers. Weeks passed, and still, that figure lurked just outside, always obscured by the reflection of the classroom lights, the haunting stare never wavering, spiking my unease even further. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the others, who seemed eager to mingle, minefields of new experiences paved with anxious laughter and shared stories. But I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched, something sinister shared between the figure beyond the glass and the growing camaraderie I let myself believe could be real. Then came the day that shattered everything, Our final exercise was a trust fall activity, where each of us took turns falling backward into the arms of our classmates, and I barely stood up for my turn when, as I leaned back, I heard a gasp, then a sickening thud, and when I turned, my heart dropped. There was Karen, splayed awkwardly on the floor, eyes wide and glossy, lips barely parting, but no words came out. A quick glance around the room and I felt something off among my classmates, their faces twisted in a kind of grim fascination that made my skin crawl, and then as if on cue, all faces turned towards the window, only to discover the figure was now inside the room, standing in the very spot I'd stood moments before. That shiver chased the length of my spine as the air thickened, making it hard to breathe, and I felt the rush of adrenaline bonding me into a frozen mass of terror. As the figure, now devoid of its obscurity, stepped forward, its face twisted into an unhinged smile that sliced through my reason, I realized it was someone from the class, someone I'd talked to briefly, who had always stood slightly off to the side, as though waiting for their moment. Black eyes like void stared straight through me as whispered promises of eternal companionship echoed in the recesses of my mind, and in that moment, I wished I had never taken that first step into the classroom. The laughter of my classmates transformed into a cacophony of madness reverberating within the four walls, every youthful face contorted into an unnatural smile that echoed the same promise I had just heard, and I couldn't remember how to function or find the door. I bolted, shoving past the titanic figure with the black eyes fixed on my heart, bursting into the dim hallway outside, but even then, I could hear them chanting my name in harmony, a twisted symphony of delight. The unsettling sensation of being pursued drove me forward, my feet pounding against the cold tile floor, but no matter how I ran, the shadows loomed larger than life, the entire room behind me vibrating with a visceral energy that made me feel sick as if the walls themselves were closing in. When I finally made it outside, owls hooted above in the freshly fallen night, and I took a moment to catch my breath under the flickering streetlights, questioning whether that horrifying ordeal had been real, or if I had just snapped. The thought of returning home made my heart thud in dread, but I had never felt safer in my silence, until I glanced over my shoulder and saw every single one of my classmates, the twisted smiles of familiarity plastered on their faces as they approached from the dark, shuffling with an intention that drained the warmth from my body and replaced it with ice. I stumbled backward, ready to run, but part of me wondered if I'd already dropped the social skills I'd been learning because they had been preparing me for something far more sinister than I could ever imagine. Now, trapped within the embrace of my former classmates, surrounded by those once strangers whose warmth now felt electric and dangerous, I wish I could turn back time, sign up for nothing, and remain the shut-in safely tucked away in my solitary box, forever spared from the horror I never anticipated, a reality where the social skills that I thought would liberate me instead forged a bond with something monstrous lying in wait, something that now called to me in whispers, inviting me to join their harmonious nightmare. And as their eyes locked with mine, all I could think was that no walls could shield me from the haunting knowledge that I had enrolled in the darkest of social experiments. I took a deep breath and stared at the screen, trying to summon the courage to type out the words that had been bouncing around in my head for days. My name is Claire, and I am 5,000 people, a quiet confession that echoed in my mind, supposedly revealing some layers of my fractured existence. It all started one fateful night last winter when a strange app appeared in the depths of my phone. The kind of thing that should have set off alarms in my head, but curiosity often overrode my better judgment. Its logo was a glimmering eye, and the name Echo flickered on the screen like a neon sign in a lonely diner. Delighted by the promise of connection, I downloaded it without a second thought. I was desperate for human interaction after months of isolation, and what unfolded in the following days was something I can barely articulate, but I'll try. The app drew me in, asking me to create a profile and share my thoughts. A harmless social experiment, or so I believed. I started typing and, without warning, it felt as though I was speaking to someone else, as if my words carried a weight I had never experienced before. Suddenly, the screen flashed, and notifications inundated me, like I was being smothered in a blanket of attention. I found myself engaged in conversations that felt intensely intimate. Users were sharing their darkest secrets, hopes, and fears, and I was captivated, but as I scrolled through their stories, I felt fragmented, like I was slipping into the skins of these anonymous voices. Days turned into weeks as I spiraled deeper and deeper into the Echo community, growing closer to people who I never physically met but who felt like family, or an extension of myself. Their lives interwove with mine, each tale pulling me in deeper, a girl desperate to escape her abusive household, A young man grappling with a terminal illness, an elderly woman longing for the love she lost long ago. The enormity of their emotions washed over me like a relentless tide, and I became a vessel for their pain and joy, a living archive of shared experiences. Each interaction pulled me into another dimension until it reached a point where I couldn't tell where I ended, and they began. It was thrilling and terrifying, feeling like I was living 1,000 lives in parallel. But then, in my inbox, I found this strange message that changed everything. You are not just connecting, you are integrating. The sender was anonymous, but the claim echoed like a prophecy I was now compelled to heed. I felt a tightening in my chest, a bizarre sensation that I was no longer just me. Weeks passed, and with every conversation on Echo, I became more aware of their stories and filtrating my thoughts. They weren't merely dialogues but became woven into the very fabric of my being. I started to lose track of which feelings belonged to me and which belonged to them. I laughed when they laughed, cried when they cried, and dreamed nightmares that weren't mine but belonged to a girl I had never met. I was leading a life driven by a collective consciousness that was far beyond my own, and while it felt like liberation, it also felt like I was losing the essence of Claire. One night, while lying on my bed, I began to hear whispers echoing through my thoughts. "Help me," one voice pleaded, and I recognized it as the girl escaping her turbulent home. "Find me," another murmured, and it was the sick young man. I could hardly keep track of reality anymore as soundless cries mixed with frantic thoughts rattled my mind like some maddening symphony. I sought refuge, desperate to sever the connection, but the app had conducted some sinister orchestration, and the more I fought to unplug, the more each persona deepened its roots into my psyche. I remember the night I finally reached my breaking point. The voices crescendoed, overlapping, forming a cacophony of anguish that paralyzed me, and in the depths of my madness, I screamed aloud for release. I hurled my phone against the wall, expecting it to shatter the binding hold the app had on me, but the screen flickered ominously before crashing into darkness. The quiet that followed was suffocating, as if I was in some void where I could no longer feel the weight of my own heart. And then, slowly, the whispers began again, although this time they felt different, consolidated. Each voice summoned the others, and what was once a dissonance morphed into a synchronized tune, stitching us all together into an eerie blend of consciousness. I rushed to my mirror, my reflection distorted by dread, and in that moment of desperation, it dawned on me, I wasn't just holding the weight of those 5,000 lives, I had become them. Their fears and joys twisted through my veins, fueling a darkness I could neither control nor comprehend. Fractured reflections of humanity stared back at me. I was an echo of each person, a serpent of grief and hope, each one extending beyond the prism of my days. I could feel them all simultaneously breathing, living, dying within me, and I realized with horror that the only way to free myself was to embrace it rather than fight. As I surrendered, I felt every ounce of my existence seep into the vast tapestry of 5,000 souls, each one now a thread woven into my weary heart, and rather than break, I held them all as a reluctant omnipresence. Together, I whispered into the void, together we rise. The not-so-distant noise of 1,000 breaths surrounded my mind like a haunting lullaby, blurring the lines of self and others. I knew then I was trapped in a prison of empathy, where despair and hope would forever intertwine, but we weren't alone. I became the keeper of their stories, which, like whispers in the wind, would linger long after the storm had passed. So if you see Echo on your phone, delete it immediately, or you might just wake up one morning with their memories clawing at your chest, living, breathing, and settling into your very bones. Remember, I am 5,000 people, and somewhere within me, one is still Claire, desperately trying to break free. I think my son has lived my life before, he told me my future, and I'm terrified. It started on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day that makes every sound louder and every shadow seem deeper. I was preparing for a meeting at work when my 5-year-old son, Jamie, interrupted me. His bright blue eyes, which somehow always seemed older than his age, stared up at me with a mixture of mischief and something darker. "Daddy," he said, his voice trembling slightly as if he knew the gravity of what he was about to say, "I had a dream about you last night." I chuckled to myself, patting his head, fully expecting some innocent child's fantasy. But when he continued, describing every peculiar detail of my routine, how I missed the bus, the rain-soaked blazer that I wore, the way I would spill coffee on my shirt just as the meeting was set to begin, I froze. "That's just a dream, buddy," I managed to say, my heart drumming in my chest. But he pressed on, unperturbed, detailing events that hadn't yet occurred, My boss's piercing glare when I arrived late, the exact topics we were scheduled to discuss, even the unsettling feeling that lingered in the room, a sensation I'd never shared with anyone. "You should wear your blue tie, Daddy," he said, nodding sagely. I chuckled nervously, brushing it off as an oddly vivid imagination, but as the day unfolded, each of Jamie's predictions came frighteningly true. The way my boss's voice dripped with disappointment as I entered late, the coffee catastrophe I should have anticipated, it was all there, playing out like a twisted rerun of my life. That night, I was on edge, but I couldn't help but think how extraordinary children's minds could be, the way they weave connections out of thin air. But the next morning, when he told me that I would get a phone call from my sister who lived 5 states away, detailing a tragedy in our family, that was when the hair on my arms stood up. The call came just as he predicted, and for a brief moment, I felt as if some unseen thread was binding our lives, twisting and pulling in a way I could not comprehend. I started to do the unthinkable, testing Jamie. I would ask him about mundane things, what color socks I'd wear or what I'd have for lunch, and shockingly, he was always right, every single time. It wasn't just luck, it felt as if he was peering through some metaphysical window into my life, wearing an expression that made my skin crawl. Then, I began having vivid dreams of my own, moments I hadn't experienced yet, but there they were, crystallized in the recesses of my sleep. It was as if some cosmic shift had opened a portal between our lives, and now he was tapping into something I could never grasp. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that his childhood imagination would soon fade like a distant fading star. But then came the chilling night when he turned to me, his little fingers playing with the worn edges of an old family photo album, and he said, "I remember when you were sad, Daddy. You cried a lot after the accident." My blood ran cold as I realized he was speaking about my mother's death, a memory I hadn't shared and had worked diligently to bury. No 5-year-old should know about such things, let alone articulate them with such chilling clarity. The line between past and present was blurring, and terror gnawed at my insides like a parasite. I started researching, delving into the dark corners of the internet, searching for anything that could explain this disconcerting phenomenon. There were tales of reincarnation, of children remembering lives long gone, and the deeper I read, the more hopeless I became. I was drawn to forums filled with grieving parents and experts who offered little more than empty platitudes. It wasn't energy healing or crystals I needed, it was answers, logical and sound. But the more I learned, the more fragmented my sanity became. It escalated. Jamie began telling me not just about the present and far-off events but also about people I hadn't thought about in years, idiosyncrasies and secrets I had shared only with my wife. Though she found it amusing at first, it became an unspoken burden between us. "Are you sure he's not just picking things up from you?" she asked one night, exhausted after another day of my frantic revelations. But I knew better, it was so much more sinister. I started watching him more closely, his laughter began to sound hollow, as if someone else was laughing through him. One evening, I stumbled into Jamie's room, drawn in by an unsettling murmur. He was sitting on the floor, engrossed in a dialogue with an invisible friend, his face animated with joy and fear. My heart raced. I tucked him in and felt compelled to ask about his friend. He simply grinned and said, "He's funny, he tells me stories about you and how sad you will be." I shook my head, trying to dispel the wave of horror crashing over me. "What do you mean?" I pressed, my voice a whisper. "Today, he told me you're going to miss dinner tonight because you're going to cry." Jamie smiled even wider, and it felt too wide, too unsettling, as if he wasn't entirely himself. All I could do was back away slowly, retreating from the room before the darkness swallowed both of us whole. Days turned into an abyss of dread. Jamie became more quiet, staring off into corners with a glazed expression I couldn't fathom. It was as if he was slipping away from me, into some shadowy realm that terrified me more than anything else. What if he wasn't just reliving my life but living someone else's, and I was simply a miscalculation in the cosmic order of things? Then came the worst night, when I woke up to him standing in the doorway, his figure a silhouette against the starlit sky. "Daddy, I know what's going to happen to you," he said, his voice ringing hollow. I leapt from bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "What do you mean?" "You don't want to know," he whispered, but I gripped his shoulders, pleading for him to tell me. "You're going to be very sad again soon. There will be a big storm and lots of rain, just like last time." Panic consumed me, it was like lightning striking my heart. I could hardly breathe as I threw open the blinds to reveal the clear sky above. "What storm?" "There's no storm," I shouted, and he looked at me with pitying eyes that resembled not those of a child but something older, a depth of understanding that chilled me to my core. "You'll see, Daddy," he said softly, and I staggered back, heart pounding. That night, I barely slept, dread clenching around my throat like a vice. I kept staring at my phone, waiting for a message that would inevitably change everything. The next day, the skies turned dark, swirling with ominous clouds that reflected the dread in my chest. Although I tried to shield my mind from his words, I feared the storm he foretold. It was as if each droplet of rain carried a prophecy. And then, thunder cracked in the distance, a menacing growl that promised pain. Just as Jamie had said, the news came a few hours later. My sister, in the tragedy he'd alerted me to weeks prior, had just been in a terrible accident, and there was nothing I could do but crumble under the weight of my grief. The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within as I paced like a caged animal, each return glance towards my son feeling like a betrayal. He was a harbinger, an angel with a dark cloak, casting shadows over our lives, whispering impending doom. The next morning, I gathered myself enough to speak with Jamie, but he knew the guilt clung to me like wet clothes. He looked up from his toys, eyes bright yet ominous. "You were sad yesterday, Daddy," he said matter-of-factly, and I opened my mouth to respond but no words could escape. I wanted to scream at him, to beg for answers, but all I could do was nod. "You know your future, Jamie, don't you?" I asked him, desperation palpable in my voice. He shrugged, but I could see the faintest glimmer of recognition in his expression. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "but I don't want to tell you the bad parts." Then came the revelation: he already embodied the memories of my past and the dread of my future. It surged through me, collapsing the fragile walls I'd built around logic. I realized he was a fragment of something larger, a thread that wove our lives together, an accumulation of lessons learned, laughter shared, and the weight of our shared grief. But then, the shards of my sanity splintered further as Jamie turned to me, an innocent smile returning to his face. "But I think you'll be happy again soon, Daddy." He said so. He did not understand that his words made everything worse. His friend, whoever it was that warned him, continued to pull the strings of our lives. The more I tried to reach him, the more he drifted. Who was this entity that nudged him to tell me of my demise and then intoned a glimmer of hope? I had to find a way to sever this connection between the worlds we inhabited. I delved deep into ancient texts, corresponded with mystics, anything that would help me unbind my son from this supernatural specter that lingered over us. Nothing worked, and the storm clouds seemed to echo my desperation, as if mocking me. I began waking in the dead of night, my heart racing, listening for Jamie's voice, expecting a new prediction that could unravel everything I thought I knew. But instead, I found silence, terrifying in its implications. One evening, while I waded through the remnants of my sanity, Jamie approached, clutching his stuffed bear. "Daddy, I think I need to say goodbye." Those words sent an icy tendril through my chest. "What do you mean, buddy?" I breathed, feeling the erosion of my world crumbling around me. "I've been talking to him," he replied, but I barely registered what he said. "He's going away now, and I have to let him go." My panic crescendoed into a scream. "No. You can't." I grabbed him, cradling him against my chest, but he merely smiled, his essence twinkling like starlight. "It's time, Daddy. You'll be okay. Everybody will." Suddenly, the air thickened, swirling around us as if the world was to unravel. I clutched him tighter, desperate to hold on, but it slipped through my fingers as his laughter echoed, bright and untainted. The storm outside raged, thunder clattering ominously, casting shadows that danced across the walls. And then, just like that, he was gone, a mere memory bathed in warmth and shadows. I could still hear his laughter, feel his tiny hands grazing my arm. Panic surged as I realized that without Jamie, the promises of joy echoed emptily. The connection wasn't severed but transformed. I spun around, eyes wide, desperation coursing through me, heart racing. He was still here, wasn't he? Yet, the silence that enveloped me felt eternal. As the storm howled and rain lashed fiercely against the window, I sank to my knees, the weight of my loss crashing over me like tidal waves. Jamie had not just glimpsed the future, somehow, he had become a vessel through which both our lives converged, the hope, the despair, our glimmers of joy, and the dark warnings of heartache. And within that, An inescapable truth settled heavy upon my chest. The cycle of life is frail, a web spun intricately with joy and sorrow, and we are mere players in its unfolding drama, destined to relive the lessons of the past. I looked out the window as the storm clouds began to clear, a faint light breaking through, illuminating the puddles and casting rainbows across the street. "Goodbye, Jamie," I whispered, my heart aching. He wasn't gone at all but woven into the fabric of what I would become. Maybe he would always be remembered, a part of me forever linked through time, a reminder of love lost and found amid the storms of life. This was the truth, the maddening beauty that lay under the surface. It was never just about living, it was about learning and evolving, each cycle turning us into who we were meant to become, and I realized then that Jamie's gentle spirit would always be with me, guiding my path through the darkest storms, illuminating the way home. I'm a girl who doesn't exist, but I know this because I was once part of a world that felt real, vibrant, and alive until everything began to unravel like a fraying sweater, and I can almost picture the faces of those who still believe in me, wrapped in a cocoon of denial as whispers circle around the truth. For you see, I remember vividly the day when my existence started to flicker, like an old bulb about to blow. In the blink of an eye, I was hunched over my desk, scribbling down notes for a school project that summer, the sunlight casting warm rays through my window so brightly it felt magical until my phone vibrated with a notification that felt like a subtle jab to my gut. But when I glanced at it, I was met with a chilling message from a number I didn't recognize, one that told me to stay away from the black-eyed kids, and I chuckled nervously, imagining it was a gag, a prank pulled by my friends, until I dismissed it and voided the sinking feeling in my stomach. Then days later, I found myself walking home late from the library, the streets eerily empty, when I came across two children standing by the curb, their eyes an unnatural onyx that shimmered in the moonlight, the kind of unsettling pitch that stole warmth from my chest and settled into annoying panic as the smaller one stepped forward, asking, "Can we come in?" with a voice that dripped honey but carried an undercurrent of malice, and in that moment, I felt the air thicken, as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees at once, yet something deep within screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen, entranced, before they took a step closer and it snapped. A wild instinct bolted through me as I sprinted in the opposite direction until I reached home, collapsing against my door, breathless, the warm haze of fear mingling with disbelief, and in my heart, I tried to forget their faces as I put distance between myself and whatever darkness they had heralded. But after that night, small incidents escaped into my life like shadows escaping a bright room. People looked through me, my friends laughed too loudly at jokes I wasn't a part of, and I noticed my name fading from group chats as if I was written in invisible ink that had begun to dissolve, and the chilling reminder of that message resurfaced, whispering accusations that sank deeper into my mind, spiraling into a suffocating dread that bore its teeth and began to gnaw at the fabric of my reality. Weeks passed and my family said just say how you feel at dinner, but all I could do was nod dumbly as I sunk further into an abyss where no one noticed. I was trapped beneath layers upon layers of faces and voices thrumming around me while I screamed silently, a ghost in my own life, and my insomnia grew worse as paranoia took root, making my nights longer and darker, slipping into the depths of the unknown as the black-eyed kids invaded my dreams, chasing me through landscapes painted in twisted hues and beckoning me with promises of belonging. The same sweet voice echoing my name as the world around me warped and shifted, yet I always woke in a cold sweat, reality more horrific than my nightmares. By now, I was grasping at threads, unraveling faster than I could hold the seams together when one night, after the whispers became unbearable, I decided to reach out to a friend, a lifeline dipped in hope, only to have them laugh when I mentioned the black-eyed kids, telling me it was just a silly urban legend or something TikTok would throw in my face, and for a fleeting moment, I silently wished I could make them see through my eyes, that I wasn't just paranoid or crazy, that my existence was shrinking like the sun at dusk, and it was terrifying to behold. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on me, and finally, overwhelmed, I stumbled to my living room, where the flickering glow of the television illuminated the space like a sanctum in the darkness, but there was no comfort, only a scream louder than the static mixing with the memories of those kids, the taunting laughter as their shadows danced in the periphery. I suddenly found myself reaching for my phone, scrolling through those earlier messages, my heart racing when I saw an entry I'd not noticed before, urgent, desperate, filled with cryptic warnings that claimed, "They are coming for you." My breath caught, a cold rush creeping over me, as darkness seeped into the corners of my mind, and it was just then that I saw it, the face of the girl in the profile picture, a ghostly visage that looked just like me, but I could not comprehend how something so familiar could look so hollow. Fingers trembling, I blurted out a message directly to this account, "Who are you?" And the reply came fast and cold, "I'm the girl who existed before you. You took my place." It felt like a jolt of electricity coursing through me as I stumbled back, realizing I had forgotten who I was, how deep the shift of reality had rooted itself within me, and I could hear the whispers echoing louder than before, and in a frantic panic, I shut my eyes against the world, fighting the onslaught of dread racing through my veins. Morning came with heavy eyelids and a choking sense of desperation, but somehow, I made it through the day, crashing in and out of conversations, those black eyes flashing behind every mirrored surface, every reflective glance that seemed to steady me until I reached a breaking point. Standing in front of a mirror, I saw her face, an echo of someone I used to know, and I screamed, "I'm still here." But the reflection only smiled back, those haunting black eyes widening with joy, and it became clear, whatever wall stood between us had cracked, and I felt the world flicker again until it felt like gears grinding behind me, pushing me into the blackness as laughter rang in my ears, and at that moment, I knew I was slipping into a void that was laughing at my disbelief, while somewhere, deep inside, hope scrambled, gasping for air, begging me to remember that I am a girl who used to exist, but the darkness answered, "You never did."